This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. Jagged stones lined the trail that afternoon, and I remember stepping over them with extra care. I didn't want to trip and twist an ankle, especially when I was by myself. The small town where I live is surrounded by old fields, rusted train tracks, and clusters of trees that get denser as you go farther. I had always felt safe walking there, even though the place sometimes gave me an uneasy feeling after sunset. A few weeks before, I met Alice at the edge of one of those trails. She didn't talk much when we first crossed paths. Her eyes looked sharp, and her tone was quiet. Yet something about her made me want to see her again, so we started meeting around dusk to walk through those winding paths. She often led me off the main routes, down into places that felt forgotten and calm in a way I couldn't describe. Today, she had asked me to meet her near an old wooden bridge. I agreed because I felt curious, even though a slight tension knotted in my stomach. I arrived a bit early, standing near the faded beams of that bridge. The bridge itself was covered in weeds and thick clumps of tall grass. It had no railings on either side. I tested a plank with my foot and felt it flex. The board seemed stable enough, but I still moved slowly. I saw Alice approaching. She didn't wave. She rarely did. She just walked up, nodded at me, and said we should get going to a spot she called the Forgotten Clearing. Her voice sounded normal, but her eyes stayed fixed on a point behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing. When I turned back, she was already on the bridge, taking measured steps. I followed her. We reached the other side after a few minutes. The air felt thick. I smelled wet leaves and old wood. The forest around us seemed darker than normal, even though the sun was still in the sky. We walked deeper into a stand of twisted trees, where the branches curled overhead. The ground was soft from a previous rain, and each step made a light squishing sound. We didn't talk. She kept looking ahead, sometimes tilting her head to one side as if she heard something. I thought about asking if everything was okay, but something in me hesitated. I remembered how she'd reacted in the past, short replies, no real explanation. It felt pointless to push her. We arrived at a small dip in the landscape that I hadn't noticed before. It was like a shallow crater with damp ground. A fallen log lay across one side, covered in moss and bits of old bark. Alice stopped, pointed at the log, and gestured for me to sit. I shrugged and lowered myself onto the log. The earth smelled musty. My feet sank a bit into the grass. Alice stood there, arms at her sides, looking at me. I kept silent, unsure what to say. I studied her face for a moment. Her eyes were bright, but her expression was blank. The silence started to feel heavy. I heard my own heartbeat, and I picked at my jacket sleeve to calm my nerves. Then I spotted a small metal box on the ground next to the log. It was partly hidden by a few leaves, but still visible if you looked hard enough. Alice noticed me staring at it. She knelt down, opened the box, and showed me what was inside. There was a short piece of rope, coiled up in a messy knot. There was a thin cloth, almost like a torn rag. There was also a small notebook filled with symbols I couldn't read. The pages looked old, stained, and the writing was thick, as if done with a heavy pen or marker. I glanced at her, but she didn't explain. She just held the box open, waiting for me to react. I didn't know what to say. My mouth felt dry. I wanted to ask her about the notebook, but my tongue felt heavy. I also realized the day was wearing on. The light had changed. The sun must have been dipping behind the trees because the clearing was dimmer now. The wind picked up and brushed past us, creating a soft noise in the leaves overhead. It sounded a bit like whispers. That made the hair on my arms stand up. "Are you okay?" I finally managed to ask. My voice sounded too loud in that silent space. She blinked once and closed the box. She set it aside and sat next to me on the log. Her leg was only a few inches from mine. I could feel my pulse thudding in my wrists. Something about that box, the rope, and the quiet tension made me want to leave. I looked around for a clear path back, but I realized we were surrounded by thick brush on most sides. The route we had used to get here was behind us, and she was sitting between me and that direction. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe this was just her private spot, but my heartbeat kept racing. The atmosphere felt wrong. The birds seemed quieter than usual. I heard a crow caw in the distance, but it sounded faint and far away. Alice shifted on the log, reaching into her jacket pocket. My muscles tensed, but she only pulled out a folded piece of paper, glanced at it, then put it back. She didn't say what it was. She just looked at me and gave a slight nod. Her face remained impassive, and that blank stare heightened my discomfort. I tried to act normal. I asked her how she discovered this place. She shrugged, said a few words about old forest maps, and then fell silent again. Her tone was clipped, as if she didn't want to talk. Each time she spoke, it felt like she was annoyed that I was asking questions. I gave up and looked down at the ground. I noticed the soil was darker in patches, with wet spots near the log. My shoes were already a little muddy. After a few minutes, I stood up. My body felt stiff because I had been sitting awkwardly. I took one step toward the path. Alice looked up at me. She didn't move, but I felt a sudden spike of adrenaline. My mouth got drier, and I licked my lips. I tried to keep my face calm. She arched an eyebrow, like she was questioning my decision to leave, but she didn't say anything. The silence was worse than if she had yelled at me. Her expression stayed oddly serene. I told her I needed to head back before dark. She didn't respond. She just stared at me. That stare felt like a physical barrier. I breathed in, started walking, and hoped she wouldn't do anything to stop me. But as I passed her, I heard her stand up behind me. My spine tingled. I glanced over my shoulder. She had the box in her hand. She wasn't threatening me with it. She was just holding it, like she wanted me to remember it was there. My pace quickened. I tried not to run, but I also tried not to lag. I reached the edge of the clearing and noticed the path was narrower than I remembered. I turned left, guessing that was the direction we came from. I looked back briefly and saw Alice standing in the middle of the clearing watching me. She still wasn't shouting or gesturing. She just stood there, her outline almost blending with the shadows. My heart pounded in my ears. As I walked, the undergrowth tugged at my jeans. Branches snapped under my feet. The wind picked up again, rattling leaves around me. My senses went into overdrive. I imagined movement in the corners of my vision. I almost called out to her, but I realized I didn't want her to follow me. I pressed on, stepping over roots and pushing through bushes. A few times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, I heard nothing. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was her. I couldn't tell. Eventually, I found the small ravine that led back to the old bridge. Relief flooded me when I saw the slats of wood. They looked weathered, but safe enough to cross. I hurried onto the bridge, carefully placing my feet on the center of each plank. The boards creaked. About halfway across, I paused and looked back. The trail behind me was silent and empty. No sign of Alice. I swallowed hard and hurried to the other side. Once my shoes hit solid ground, I jogged. My breathing was shallow. I felt the muscles in my shoulders tightening. I just wanted to get to an open area. I didn't stop until I reached a main dirt path that led back to town. Only then did I feel the tightness in my chest start to ease. The sun was setting behind the trees, but at least I saw wide fields ahead, and I knew I was close to a small road that sometimes had passing trucks. I looked over my shoulder a final time. I didn't see her. I didn't see anything unusual. The place seemed peaceful from a distance, as though none of that tension had ever existed. But I knew what I felt. My limbs were still trembling. My palms were slick with sweat. My heartbeat pounded in my skull. Something about that box and the way she carried herself made me think she had a plan for me that afternoon, one that I interrupted by leaving too soon. That idea made me uneasy, but I kept moving toward home. When I reached the outskirts of the town, the last light of the day painted the sky a dull gray. Houses were spaced out, with only a few porch lights on. I saw a neighbor's dog behind a fence. It barked as I passed, making me jump. I forced a laugh at my own jumpiness, but that feeling of dread didn't vanish. I wondered if Alice would appear in my yard later, or if she would track me down the next time I walked the trails. I had no idea what she was capable of, and that unknown left me anxious. I went inside my small house. I locked the door and leaned against it for a moment, catching my breath. My shirt was damp with sweat. The place was silent. I noticed how tense my shoulders were, and I tried to stretch out my arms to release some of that stiffness. My phone sat on the table, but I couldn't think of anyone to call or anything to say. What would I even report? A strange woman took me to a clearing with a metal box full of odd stuff. It sounded trivial. She hadn't threatened me outright. She hadn't tried to harm me. But her presence felt so oppressive that my mind started racing again. I told myself that I would avoid her from now on. If she invited me out for a walk, I would refuse. But I also knew I was too curious for my own good. Part of me wanted to see what was in that notebook. Another part of me wanted to figure out why she looked so blank all the time, like she was barely there. At the same time, a cold sense of self-preservation told me to keep my distance. My stomach churned at the thought of going back to that clearing. I decided to get some water and sit down for a bit. The normalcy of my kitchen felt comforting. The overhead light was steady and bright. The sink faucet squeaked as usual, and the glass in my hand felt solid. I drank a full glass of water and took slow breaths. I walked into the living room and flipped on a lamp. Everything about my house felt ordinary, yet I couldn't shake the memory of that rope, that rag, and those symbols scrawled in the notebook. I kept replaying the moment when Alice smiled at me right before I left. It wasn't warm or welcoming. It was calm, like she'd been expecting me to show fear. Her smile seemed to confirm that she saw my discomfort. That unsettled me more than if she had chased me through the forest. I realized the real fear didn't come from loud threats or violent gestures. It came from not knowing what might happen next, or how far someone like Alice would go. That night, I closed my windows early. I double-checked the locks. I turned the lights off one by one, stepping carefully to my bedroom. My bed felt safe, but my mind wouldn't slow down. For hours, I lay there, hearing every creak of the old house and every gust of wind outside. My throat stayed dry, and my heartbeat took a long time to settle into a calmer rhythm. I tried to push away the images of the clearing, the box, and Alice's quiet stare. I managed to doze off eventually, but the tension lingered in my muscles. The next day, I woke up early, feeling worn out. I looked out the window and saw the same quiet scenery. Trees in the distance, a few fields with tall grass, and a grayish sky. I felt relieved there was no sign of Alice, but I kept wondering if she would show up somewhere along my usual route. The thought stayed with me as I got ready for the day. My reflection in the mirror looked tired. I told myself I wouldn't go back to that old trail for a while. I would take different roads, maybe drive if I needed to go near the fields. I would make sure to keep my distance, yet I couldn't forget that sense of dread. I couldn't forget how she just stood there, holding that metal box with those bizarre items. And I couldn't forget her expression when I finally decided to leave. All of it made me uneasy. Even now, every step I take around town feels charged with a bit of caution. I'm careful when I turn corners. I glance up and down the street. I check behind me more than I ever did before. And I keep replaying that last look on her face as I walked away, knowing that the scariest part wasn't something she did. It was everything she might do if I ever let my guard down again. Rigid clouds hovered over the winding road as I steered my car toward my father's remote property in Tasmania. The tires kicked up loose gravel, and my jaw felt tight from the long drive. I had made this trip many times before to check on the old house, but something felt off right from the start this time. There was a stale smell in the air when I opened the car door, and I could see tall trees looming around the property. Their branches tapped against the upper walls like someone knocking, but I told myself it was just the wind. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The floorboards gave their usual creak, which I had gotten used to over the years. The house was dark. I reached for the light switch, but the power was out. I had expected that. It happened often, but I still felt a jolt of frustration. I set my bag down on a small wooden table near the entrance. At first, everything looked normal in the dull glow of the flashlight I carried. The living room furniture had a thin layer of dust, and the old curtains were drawn. I walked to the kitchen to check the breaker box. The wooden boards under my feet groaned with each step. When I reached the box, I found all the switches in place. I flipped them off, then on again, but nothing changed. No hum of electricity, no sudden light. I resigned myself to a dark night. I made my way back to the living room, deciding to place a few candles around. While rummaging in a drawer for candles, I noticed the toolbox on the table. It was open. I remembered placing it in a cabinet on my last visit. Some tools were scattered across the surface. A hammer, a couple of screwdrivers, and a few nails lay there in disarray. That didn't make sense. I felt my stomach clench. There weren't any broken windows or forced locks, so I doubted an intruder had stolen anything. Still, the toolbox being out made me uneasy. I grabbed a few candles, found matches, and lit them. Their small flames flickered, creating shifting shadows on the walls. The gloom in the house felt heavier than usual. I tried to brush off the tension in my chest, but my hands shook a bit when I realized there were footprints in the dust near the tools. They looked like partial shoe prints. It was hard to tell how fresh they were, but I hadn't left them. I took a breath, trying to keep steady. I told myself someone might have wandered in, got spooked, and left without taking anything. That thought didn't comfort me much, but I decided to keep a clear head. I ate a quick meal from a can and set my flashlight on the counter. I checked the doors again, locking them from the inside. The door at the back had a weak latch and never sealed properly, so I dragged a small bookshelf in front of it. My father had always talked about fixing that door, but he never got around to it. I felt exposed and wanted extra security. I propped a wooden chair against the front doorknob too, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if somebody forced their way in. My heart thumped at every small noise. The beams overhead made a faint cracking sound as the temperature dropped. Later, I settled in the living room with my flashlight. I planned to keep watch before attempting to sleep. Outside, I heard the wind moving through the tall trees. The branches clacked together, sounding like they were hitting the exterior walls in rhythmic taps. Off to one side, an owl hooted, but it came through muffled. My ears strained for anything out of place, and my stomach tightened when I thought I heard gravel crunch outside the window. I rose from the chair, walked over, and peered through the glass. It was too dark to see much, but the faint moonlight illuminated the yard. Nothing moved. I returned to my seat, telling myself to relax. My body refused to calm down, though. Every muscle felt tight. The only source of light was the flickering candle on the coffee table. Time passed slowly. I checked my phone, saw that the battery was low, and put it away. There was no signal out here anyway. The quiet grew. Around midnight, I heard distinct footsteps on the gravel outside. They were slow and deliberate, not a quick crunch, but a measured pacing. I stood up, stifling the urge to call out. My mouth went dry. My pulse beat loudly in my ears. I reached for the flashlight, turned it off to avoid being seen, and crept to the window. I parted the curtain a tiny bit. The angle was bad, but I caught a glimpse of something in the yard. It looked like a figure, mostly hidden by one of the tall trees. They weren't moving much, just standing there. My skin prickled. A rush of nervous energy shot through my limbs. Part of me wanted to throw the door open and chase them away. Another part of me felt frozen. I decided it was safer to stay inside. That was the moment I realized I might not be alone. I returned to the living room chair, breathing slowly to keep my composure. The footsteps continued outside, circling the perimeter. I couldn't see the figure from where I sat, but I imagined them looking for a weak point, maybe searching for a way in. My heart hammered so loud I was sure they would hear it if they got close to a window. The entire situation felt unreal, yet here I was, locked in an old house with no power, listening to someone shuffle around outside in the darkness. After a while, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My imagination filled in the blanks. I pictured the figure standing at a corner of the house, listening for any noise from me, waiting for me to slip up. Every board creak under my feet felt like a warning. At one point, I heard a faint scrape against the back wall, near the door I had barricaded. It lasted a second, then silence again. I thought about making a run for my car, but that meant going outside, and I didn't know where the stranger was. I stayed in that chair for what felt like hours, occasionally tiptoeing to the window, checking for signs of movement. The candle burned down to a stub, and the living room slipped further into darkness. My flashlight became my only reliable light, but I kept it off to avoid drawing attention. Each time a floorboard popped in the hallway, I jolted. I realized I was trembling slightly. My hands felt slick with sweat. At around 3 a.m, the entire environment seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down, and even the owl stopped hooting. The stillness pressed on my ears. My mind kept drifting to the open toolbox. The thought of someone rummaging through my father's things without my knowledge made me angry. But that anger melted into fear every time a new creak sounded in the house. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and my eyes started closing on their own. I tried to stay alert, but nodded off for a moment. I woke with a jolt when I heard another faint movement outside. This time it was near the front door. I held my breath, focusing on the small sounds. The doorknob rattled once, then silence. I glanced at the wooden chair I'd propped against the knob. It shook a bit, but it held. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I gripped the flashlight, ready to switch it on or swing it if I had to. Nothing else happened right then. The tension in the air got thicker, but I didn't hear more steps. I waited and waited, resisting the urge to move. My neck ached from straining to listen. Finally, the night edged toward dawn. I saw a faint gray light through the windows. With the approach of morning, my anxiety lifted a bit, though my gut remained clenched. I stood up slowly, feeling pins and needles in my legs. I peeked outside. The yard looked empty. The tall trees stood still. Some low fog clung to the edges of the property. I decided it was time to check the exterior before I left. I quietly slid the chair away from the door, unlatched it, and stepped onto the front porch. The cold morning air stung my cheeks. The gravel under my shoes made a familiar crunch. I saw no footprints, no sign that anyone had been standing there. The porch and yard looked normal, just damp from overnight moisture. I walked around the side of the house, where I heard the scraping noise hours ago. Again, there was nothing. No footprints, no tool marks. My shoulders stayed tense, though. I knew what I'd heard. I circled back to the front and stepped inside. A wave of relief hit me once I locked the door again, but I still felt uneasy. The sense that someone had tested the house remained. I decided I didn't want to stay another night. I considered searching the place in daylight, but something told me it wouldn't help. The intruder, if that's what they were, had vanished without a trace. I spent the next hour securing what I could. I put the tools back in the cabinet, locked windows to the best of my ability, and wiped my footprints from the dust near the door, just in case I needed to identify other prints later. It felt like a wasted effort, but I did it anyway. My hands still shook from a lingering rush of adrenaline. Before leaving, I checked the back door. The small bookshelf was still in front of it. I pushed it aside and tested the latch. It was loose, but intact. Nothing looked forced. I slid the bookshelf back in place, patted it, and stepped away. I realized how exhausted I was. My shoulders slumped. My spine felt stiff. I locked up and walked to the car. The engine started with a heavy rumble. I glanced at the house one more time. From the outside, it seemed peaceful, just an old wooden structure in a remote spot. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that it wanted me gone, or that someone behind those walls wanted me to leave. My father's place had been a refuge once, but now it felt like a trap. As I drove off, I caught sight of the tree line in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw a figure standing there among the trunks. I couldn't be sure. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I pressed the gas. The house disappeared behind me, and I kept looking back until the road curved. When I finally reached a main highway, I felt my body ease a little. I turned on the radio for some background noise, but the tension in my neck remained. I thought about calling someone to explain what had happened, but I didn't know where to start. There was no crime scene, no damage, no direct threat, just the torment of a silent presence moving around in the dark. I settled on telling myself that next time I would bring a friend along or plan to visit during daylight hours only. Hours later, I got back to my own place and put my bag down. Everything felt normal there. Lights worked, neighbors were around. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of those dragging steps outside the house in Tasmania. I had spent nights there before and heard odd noises, but this was different. It was too deliberate. Nothing was stolen, though, and no windows were broken. That fact weighed on me. Whoever it was seemed more interested in studying the house than in stealing anything. I didn't sleep well for a few days after that. My dreams placed me back in the living room, the candle flickering, waiting for footsteps on the gravel. Sometimes I thought I heard tapping on the walls in my own home, but it was just the settling of pipes or the usual night sounds. I hoped that next time I visited my father's place, it would be quiet. Yet a part of me expected more of the same. That tension still lingered in my body, reminding me that the worst fear can come from waiting in the dark, not knowing who or what steps around the perimeter. Grimy tires left faint streaks on the gravel driveway when I arrived at the house that afternoon. I stepped out of my truck and noticed a stale odor in the air. The place looked ordinary from a distance, an older building set behind a few thin trees. I was there to inspect a reported fly infestation. The owner, an older woman with tense eyes, had called my company complaining of too many flies inside, both alive and dead, scattered around without any clear cause. I didn't expect much more than a clogged drain or an overlooked trash area, but I brought my usual tools just in case. I walked up to the front porch. The boards creaked. The woman opened the door a moment before I knocked. She gave me a tight smile and waved me inside. Once I stepped through, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. There was no overt smell of garbage. Actually, the air felt strangely clean, as if the interior had been scrubbed with too much disinfectant. The woman told me her name, though my memory blurred it later. She said she'd lived there for several years and never had a problem like this until a few weeks ago. She beckoned me further into the house, explaining that she'd already tried homemade traps and store-bought repellents, but nothing worked. I walked down the main hallway, shining a small flashlight on the floorboards and corners. I saw a few dead flies scattered near the baseboards. A couple of live ones buzzed lazily in the air, drifting in unpredictable loops. I knelt to check one of the dead flies, nudging it with a gloved fingertip. It appeared intact, not crushed. I didn't see any obvious sign of decay or unusual fluid. The woman stood behind me, wringing her hands. Her posture looked tense. She kept asking if I found anything. I told her I was still checking. She nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on me. I took a step into the living room. The furniture was neat, with clean surfaces. There was no rotten food on the table or plates left out. Everything looked orderly, almost too orderly. I felt a slight chill in my spine, but I tried to ignore it. I moved on to the kitchen. Again, I saw no signs of spills or unwashed dishes. The fridge door sealed well, and there was no strong odor. I opened a cupboard, expecting to see some old produce or a hidden source of moisture, but it was empty and spotless. I frowned, feeling a surge of confusion. Usually, flies came from something decaying or from openings in windows. I made a note to check the window screens later. I decided to head upstairs. The woman insisted that most of the flies had been found on the ground floor, but she also mentioned a few sightings near the attic hatch. I looked at the steps leading up. They were wooden and narrow, with a slight curve at the top. I took each step slowly, shining my flashlight ahead. The air felt heavier the farther I went. My ears picked up a faint buzzing, but I couldn't tell which direction it came from. At the top of the stairs, I found a hallway with 3 doors. 2 led to bedrooms, and 1 was a small bathroom. I poked around each room, opening closets and shining my light in corners. I spotted a few stray flies on a windowsill. They were still alive, but barely moving, as if exhausted. I scooped one up in a small container to examine it later. The woman hovered in the doorway, arms folded across her chest. I asked her about the attic. She pointed to a square hatch in the ceiling above the hallway. I pulled down the folding ladder and climbed up, pushing the attic door open. A stale odor washed over me, not strongly, but enough to make me grimace. I called down to her, said I'd take a look. She nodded but didn't follow. Inside the attic, the light from my flashlight cut across dust floating in the air. The space was cramped. The floor had scattered insulation and a few wooden planks. It wasn't a cluttered attic with boxes or old belongings. Instead, it felt oddly empty. I crawled a bit, shining my light into corners. The insulation looked undisturbed. I noticed a few more dead flies clustered around the edges, but nothing like a swarm or hive. My heart beat a little faster, though. I couldn't pinpoint why. The silence pressed on my ears, broken only by the faint hum of my flashlight's battery. I stood up carefully, knocking my shoulder against a rafter. I muttered a curse under my breath and aimed the flashlight along the sloped ceiling. Shadows caught my eye. The rafters seemed to bend at odd angles, though I knew it was just the shape of the roof. I crouched again, moving slowly. That buzzing I heard downstairs came back, or maybe it was just in my head. I spotted more dead flies in a tight cluster near one corner. I moved closer, expecting to see a nest or some rotting material, but there was nothing. The wood looked dry, and there was no water damage. The flies just lay there, wings crumpled. I felt a light touch of panic. It wasn't rational, but I couldn't help it. The space felt tense, like it was watching me. I told myself to remain calm. I was here to do a job, find the source. No sign of mold, no open vents. I shone the flashlight near the edges, checking for tiny gaps in the roof. Nothing. That sense of emptiness pressed down on me. I took a slow breath and swallowed. I backed away from the corner and climbed down the ladder. The woman was waiting at the bottom, her face pinched. She asked if I found anything. I shook my head. She asked if it was normal for flies to appear with no visible cause. I admitted it was unusual, but not impossible. Sometimes a single entry point in a house could be enough. She didn't look satisfied. I tried to keep my tone reassuring, but I'm sure I sounded uneasy. We went back downstairs. I walked around the outside of the house to check the foundation and walls. The exterior paint was peeling a bit, but the structure looked solid. No big cracks, no obvious holes. The windows seemed sealed. I began to suspect the flies might be slipping in through the attic somehow, but I had no proof. The woman followed me, occasionally glancing around as if she expected someone else to appear. I decided to run a quick test with the windows. I unlatched them, looked at the screens, and latched them again. Everything was intact. I felt my frustration grow. Part of me wanted to find a rotting animal in the walls or a broken vent. I disliked leaving a client without an answer, but my nerves kept buzzing like the wings of those flies. The woman asked if I felt something strange in the attic. I gave a curt reply, trying to stay professional, but I saw her expression. She knew I felt it too. After a brief pause, I suggested we check the crawl space under the house. She gave me a flashlight she had in a closet. I knelt down by a small door in the side of the foundation, pried it open, and shone my light in. Dust motes swirled in the narrow beam. I sniffed the air. A musty smell hung there, but it wasn't the scent of decaying animals. I crawled partway inside, my back brushing the floorboards above. I saw spider webs and piles of dry leaves, but no sign of a major infestation. My pulse quickened, though, because the cramped space made me feel trapped. I had to shuffle backward to get out. My shirt clung to my skin from sweat. I stood up and told her everything looked normal. My voice cracked a bit. I cleared my throat, feeling a rush of embarrassment. She sighed, rubbing her arms. We walked back inside. By this point, the air felt heavier, like a storm was approaching, even though it was a clear day. I jotted some notes, though they felt useless. I'd list that there were multiple flies, both living and dead, with no clear source. I'd note that the attic was oddly empty, that the house was tidy. Before leaving, I wanted one last pass through the living room. As I stepped in, A single fly brushed against my cheek. It startled me more than it should have. I swatted it away. It drifted up toward the ceiling. I heard a slight buzzing near my ear, then it faded. I turned around, scanning the floor and walls. I saw a few more dead flies near a corner. The woman stood in the doorway, silently watching. She asked me if I believed in anything unusual. I shook my head. I told her I specialized in practical solutions. She nodded slowly, then lowered her gaze to the ground. My shoulders tensed up again. I said I would give her a report and come back if I found a new approach. She walked me to the door. As I stepped out, I felt a rush of fresh air, and it eased my mind a bit. I carried my tools back to the truck. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw her standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I noticed a couple of flies landing on my windshield, then taking off again. A wave of unease crawled up my spine. I told myself it was just chance. The drive home was tense. My mind kept replaying the attic scene, those pockets of dead flies, and that suffocating feeling. I tried to think of a logical cause. Maybe the house had hidden leaks, or maybe there was a vent problem I missed. But nothing fit the facts. I'd seen houses with severe infestations before, and there was always a clear reason. Garbage left out, a dead animal in the walls, something easy to track. This situation felt different, though I couldn't explain why in plain terms. When I got back to my office, I took out the small container with the nearly dead fly. Under a magnifying lamp, I examined its wings and body. I didn't see parasites or odd discoloration. It just seemed weak, as if it had run out of energy. I jotted down some notes but realized I was running in circles. I placed the fly in a small plastic bag, intending to discard it later. That night, I lay in bed, replaying every step. The image of the attic corners hovered in my thoughts. My heartbeat sped up whenever I recalled that cramped space. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the insulation gave me a weird reaction. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, even though I saw no evidence. My skin crawled every time I remembered those silent, drifting flies on the edge of my vision. The next morning, I told my supervisor about the job. I kept my explanation brief, mentioning only that the client's house was exceptionally clean and that the attic and crawl space showed no typical sources of infestation. My supervisor shrugged. Sometimes, he said, it's just bad luck or a neighbor's problem. But the house was remote, and I hadn't seen any neighboring property. I felt my chest tighten again. I jotted down a short report, stating I'd return if necessary. The woman never called back, at least not that week. I felt tempted to drive by on my own, but I decided it was best to wait. Over the next few days, I found myself double-checking attics in other clients' homes, as if comparing them. None felt like hers. In normal cases, I saw dusty boxes, old clothes, maybe a mouse nest. But that house had been silent and nearly empty. My pulse quickened each time I remembered the hush in that attic, the sound of my own shoes on the boards, the sight of those scattered dead flies. I couldn't do much more. My job is to find a cause. Without evidence, I can't fix a problem that might not exist physically. Yet the tension from that visit still weighs on me whenever I think about it. I wonder if more flies turned up, or if they all disappeared as suddenly as they arrived. Part of me wants to know, but part of me dreads returning to that silent attic. Something in that house rejected explanation. Something there felt like it was watching me. And even though I can't back that up with solid facts or data, I know how my skin prickled and how my breathing sped up in that quiet space. I know I felt an unease that had nothing to do with blocked drains or rotting debris, and I remember those lifeless wings scattered in the corners, seeming to defy any reason I've learned in my years on this job. Concrete messages started flooding my inbox one spring, and I remember feeling slightly intrigued each time I saw Ken's username appear at the top of my chat list. I had just begun exploring various online communities, and he was one of the first people who seemed genuinely curious about my interests in film scores and old horror movies. Our first conversations felt smooth. He asked me polite questions, made friendly observations, and showed me new music recommendations. I felt comfortable enough to stay online longer than usual, waiting to see if he would message me again. Over the next few weeks, I noticed I enjoyed talking with Ken more than with most strangers online. His messages were always polite and direct. He asked about my day, my job, the foods I liked. He never demanded personal details like my phone number or address, but I realized he did probe a bit about my routine. For instance, he sometimes asked which cafes I visited or which times I usually took walks. I initially brushed it off, thinking he was just being thorough in getting to know me. My shoulders would tense slightly whenever he asked these questions, but I answered in vague terms. He seemed content with partial answers, so I didn't feel threatened. I asked him for a photo a few times. Ken would send low-resolution selfies, usually grainy, often with poor lighting. They were never clear. I couldn't make out his exact features. When I asked why the pictures were so blurry, he laughed it off, saying his phone camera was old. Something about that explanation didn't fully satisfy me, but I liked our conversations enough that I let it go. One evening, he suggested we meet in person. I remember sitting at my desk, seeing his invitation flash on the screen. He proposed a small cafe downtown, saying it was neutral territory. I felt a flutter of nerves. Meeting someone from the internet had always seemed risky, yet I was curious about him. I also felt a quiet nudge of caution, but I typed back that I would give it some thought. He didn't press me right away. After 2 more weeks of exchanging messages, I decided to accept his invitation. We picked a date and a time in the late afternoon, hoping the cafe would be busy enough to feel safe. On the day of the meeting, I arrived 15 minutes early. The place was smaller than I expected, with a few tables by the windows and a row of uncomfortable stools at the counter. A flickering fluorescent light overhead gave the interior a clinical feel. I scanned the faces inside, looking for someone who resembled Ken's blurry selfies. No one seemed to match. I ordered a small coffee and settled at a table near the door. I checked my phone. The time showed 4:02 p.m., 2 minutes past our agreed time. I tried not to fidget, but my foot tapped the floor. I hated feeling nervous. Around 4:05, a man stood up from a corner booth, smoothed out his jacket, and walked toward me. His movements were slow, almost cautious. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with a slight tilt of his head. I asked, "Ken?" He nodded, barely. I smiled, feeling the tension in my stomach. His face looked different from what I'd imagined. His features were sharper, and he carried a serious expression. He sat down across from me without offering a handshake. I asked if he wanted to order anything, but he shook his head, saying he'd already had a coffee. I noticed his voice was quieter than I expected, and he avoided eye contact. For the first several minutes, I tried to carry the conversation. I asked how his day was going, what he thought of the cafe, whether the bus ride there had been okay. His answers were clipped, like 1 or 2 words. He barely asked me anything. He spent more time looking around the cafe, scanning the few people sitting there. My heart thumped uneasily. In our online chats, he had seemed warm, maybe a bit shy, but still friendly. Now, in person, he radiated a strange tension, as if this entire meeting was uncomfortable for him. After 10 minutes of choppy conversation, he cleared his throat and said something about a friend who lived nearby, someone who wanted to meet me. I felt confused. Why would his friend want to meet me? I asked for details. He mentioned the friend had read some of our online chats. He said the friend was curious about me. That sounded odd. My skin prickled with a mild wave of anxiety. I told him I wasn't comfortable meeting someone else that day. I thought we were just getting to know each other first. He didn't push me aggressively, but he repeated the invitation a few more times, like it was important. My gut told me to leave. I forced a polite laugh and reminded him I had someplace else to be soon. I could sense a flicker of disappointment in his eyes, but he kept that same quiet expression. He said we should at least walk together for a while so he could introduce me to this person. I declined again, firmly this time. Then I stood up, ready to exit. He rose as well, moving with a slow, deliberate motion. For a split second I worried he might try to block my way. Instead, he just kept his distance, turning his body sideways. His half-smile didn't reach his eyes. I walked outside without looking back, inhaling the city air. My pulse drummed in my neck. I felt shaky. Part of me was disappointed that the meeting had been so strange. Another part of me was relieved I got out of there without further incident. I hurried down the block, glancing over my shoulder. Ken didn't follow me. He lingered in front of the cafe door for a few seconds, then went back inside. That was the last I saw of him face to face. That night, I received a long email from him. The tone was more formal than usual. He wrote that he was disappointed I didn't want to meet his friend. He didn't threaten me, but he phrased things in a way that made me uneasy, using lines like, "You shouldn't dismiss opportunities to widen your social circle." It felt like an indirect scolding. I decided not to respond immediately. I needed time to think. My heart pounded each time I reread his words. Over the next few days, I got more emails from him, but they started coming from different addresses. The messages had strange details, like references to my daily habits, subtle hints that he knew which grocery store I shopped at or what time I usually commuted. That spiked my anxiety. I tried to recall if I'd ever told him those details. Maybe I mentioned them casually in chat. Maybe he pieced them together. I couldn't be sure. My nerves felt raw. Then I got a direct message from an unfamiliar username. The person claimed to be a mutual acquaintance of Ken. They said they were curious why I backed out of the proposed meeting so abruptly. Their words made it sound like they were part of some tight-knit circle that liked to watch people's reactions. My skin crawled reading it. None of it was blatantly threatening, yet each new line felt invasive, as if someone was dissecting my life from a distance. I blocked that username. A few hours later, another popped up, referencing the same topic. I felt cornered. I started double-checking my social media settings, changing passwords, removing personal information. My stomach twisted whenever a new message arrived. I tried to keep calm, telling myself these were just random internet trolls. But something in Ken's calm tone made me think this was more orchestrated. One night, I looked out my living room window and saw a dark figure at the end of the block. I couldn't be sure it was Ken or anyone connected to him, but the timing rattled me. My hands shook as I locked the door. I decided to respond to him one last time. I wrote a short email stating I was done with this situation. I asked him to stop contacting me. I blocked every address I knew. Over the next few days, my inbox remained quiet. My tension decreased, but I couldn't fully relax because a new account might appear at any moment. I found myself glancing around whenever I left my house, scanning the sidewalks for anyone who might be watching. A week later, a new email arrived from a different alias, but the style of writing made me think it was Ken. The text referred to an experiment and said I had failed by giving in to fear. My pulse quickened as I read. My palms went clammy, and I could hear my heartbeat. I imagined Ken behind a keyboard, or maybe that friend he'd mentioned, typing these words just to unsettle me. There was no direct threat, just a sense of being studied or tested. I blocked that address too. Gradually, the messages stopped, or at least I stopped checking that email account. I created a new one for personal use, told only a few trusted contacts, and avoided social media altogether for a while. That shift helped me regain a sense of control. My anxiety lessened, although I felt a dull paranoia whenever I heard unfamiliar footsteps outside or got an unexpected knock at the door. I tried to tell myself Ken was just a bored individual looking for kicks, and that maybe I had overreacted. But I knew, deep down, the fear I felt was real. Something about those messages and his behavior in person had triggered a genuine alarm in my mind. Months passed. I didn't hear from him. I relaxed my guard a bit. I reopened a couple of my old social media pages, set them to private, and used a fake name. Now and then, I still glanced at my block list to ensure the suspicious accounts were still locked out. I never saw Ken's face again. Sometimes I wondered if he and that supposed friend had moved on to some other target. A mild sense of guilt nagged at me, as if I had let them get to me too easily. But my instincts told me it was better to be cautious than to let them back in. Even after all that time, I couldn't fully forget his quiet stare in the cafe, the stiff way he carried himself, or that strange suggestion that his friend needed to evaluate our meeting. I replayed that moment in my head, trying to grasp why he insisted on bringing someone else into the picture. In the end, it didn't matter. I was safe, and that was enough. Today, I keep a tight hold on my privacy. I don't accept random friend requests or engage deeply with strangers online. I know that behind the friendliest messages, there might be a person with unclear motives. If I ever come across someone who reminds me of Ken's mannerisms, short replies, distant looks, vague references to outside people, I feel a surge of unease. It's not that I'm scared of the internet itself, but I learned that isolation and anonymity can make anyone a potential puzzle, and some puzzles aren't worth solving. Looking back, I realized the scariest part wasn't any outright threat. It was the slow drain of my trust and the nagging feeling that someone out there was quietly observing my responses. The tension came from not knowing what their plan was or why they found me interesting. I never got a clear answer, and I suspect I never will. In a way, that's what leaves the deepest mark. The fear wasn't about being attacked physically. It was about someone playing with my mind through messages and subtle hints, showing me that intrusion can happen without a single door forced or a single scream heard. That's what stays with me the most. Stark silence dominated the dorm hallway that evening. I remember the time. It was nearly midnight, and I had just finished studying in the lounge area of our religious university. My back hurt from hours of sitting at a small desk, and my eyes felt gritty from staring at textbooks. I usually took the stairs to my room on the 4th floor, but that night I wanted a quicker route. The elevator at the end of the corridor seemed like a small luxury, even though it was hardly ever used. I walked toward it, hearing the soft sound of my shoes on the tiled floor. The dorm was neat. The staff made sure everything stayed organized, especially the common areas. I reached the elevator doors. They were stainless steel and reflected the overhead fluorescent light in a harsh glare. I pressed the call button. It lit up with a faint click, and the doors slid open with barely any noise. The interior glowed under a single overhead lamp that flickered for a second before stabilizing. I stepped inside, letting out a small sigh of relief that I wouldn't have to tackle 4 flights of stairs. I pressed the button for my floor. The elevator doors shut with a sound that was too soft for my liking. There was no mechanical clank, just a quiet whoosh as the panels met in the middle. That was when I first felt an odd sensation crawl down my arms. The air inside the cab seemed still, as if sealed off from the rest of the building. I stared at the glowing numbers on the panel, waiting for them to change, but the elevator took a moment to start moving. My grip tightened on my backpack strap. The fluorescent light above me gave off a cold brightness, washing out the color of my jacket and reflecting against the mirror on the back wall. That mirror caught my attention. It looked perfectly normal on the surface, but something about how it reflected the overhead light felt off. The corners of my reflection seemed to warp slightly, as though the edges were curved or the light wasn't hitting it correctly. I took a small step forward, then felt a sudden shiver. The hair on my arms stood up. I told myself it was just the chill of the elevator, maybe a draft from the vent. Finally, the elevator began to ascend, moving without much vibration. I tried to distract myself by thinking of the theology class I had taken that week, but the sense of being watched clung to me. My palms became damp against my backpack strap. I glanced again at the mirror. My reflection was there, but there was a vague distortion near my shoulder. I blinked and looked away. I tried to shrug it off as a glare or a trick of the old lighting. The elevator jolted to a stop earlier than I expected. The display above the buttons showed I was on the correct floor, but the doors remained closed. My stomach flipped. I pressed the door open button. Nothing happened. My chest tightened, and I pressed it again, harder this time. I heard a faint click, then the light overhead flickered once. The reflection in the mirror seemed to shift momentarily, as if there was an outline behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the space was empty. The corners of the cab were bare. No one else was there. I stood there, breathing fast. My ears felt plugged, as though air pressure had changed. I reminded myself that sometimes old elevators get stuck. The silence pressed against me. Even the typical hum of machinery in an elevator seemed absent. The walls felt close. I pressed the button for my floor again, hoping to restart the mechanism. The light flickered for a second time. That was when I heard a soft clicking sound from above, like a tiny piece of metal tapping against another surface. Then, as abruptly as it had stopped, the elevator jerked again, and with a faint buzz, the doors finally slid open. I rushed out, stumbling into the hallway. My feet landed on the worn carpet, and I breathed a sigh of relief. The corridor lights felt warm compared to that sterile glow inside. I realized my hands were shaking. I rubbed them against my sides. The hallway was empty. Most people were either asleep or in their rooms. I looked back at the elevator. The doors were slowly closing, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of that mirror again. I could see my reflection in it, smaller now, but I swore I noticed a shape behind me, near the back wall. Then the doors shut, hiding whatever was there, or wasn't. I swallowed hard and hurried to my room. The door clicked behind me as I locked it. My chest rose and fell with each breath. I dropped my bag by the desk and sat on my bed. My heart was still pounding. I wanted to tell myself that the entire moment was just nerves or lack of sleep. It had been a demanding week with exams and papers. Maybe my eyes had played tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the memory of that second when I saw a distorted outline near my reflection. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy. I tried to forget the incident, telling myself that I had simply been tired. I went to my classes, had lunch in the crowded cafeteria, and by afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that the elevator ride was a small mechanical glitch, and my anxiety had caused the rest. Still, there was a nagging tension in the back of my mind. Every time I passed the elevator in the lobby, I felt a twinge of discomfort, so I avoided using it. The stairs seemed safer, even if they were more exhausting. A few days later, I found myself laden with 2 heavy textbooks and a large folder. My legs ached from a long day of lectures, so I stood in front of the elevator doors again, debating whether to step inside. The memory of that odd moment was still fresh, but I told myself that I was being silly. Dozens of people probably used this elevator daily without issues, and maybe I was the only one who had a weird experience. Still, I hesitated long enough that someone else came by, a student from my philosophy class. He pressed the call button and gave me a polite nod. I forced a smile, watched the doors open, and I let him step in first. When I followed him inside, the light overhead shone the same cold white. The walls looked normal. The mirror reflected the 2 of us standing there. The ride went smoothly. We stopped at his floor first. He got out, and I stayed on, alone again for the last floor. Suddenly, the same heaviness in the air returned. My lungs felt tight. The hum of the elevator seemed to fade. The mirror, at a glance, looked fine, but I still had that crawling sense on the back of my neck. I tapped my foot impatiently, waiting for the doors to open. This time, I reached my floor without delay, and they slid apart as they should. Nothing strange happened, but my nerves were on edge. I hurried out, relieved to be free of that enclosed space. From that point on, I tried my best to avoid the elevator entirely. If I saw it, I'd feel a mild tension in my stomach. There was something about the silence in there, or maybe the reflection in the mirror, that unsettled me. My classmates didn't notice anything odd. People passed in and out of the elevator throughout the day. I occasionally heard them chatting about how slow it could be, but no one else reported the strange flickers or the feeling of being watched. One late afternoon, I was walking down the hallway near the elevator. The corridor was empty. I glanced at the elevator doors and felt a sudden chill, as though a draft had passed through. The air conditioning in our dorm was usually steady, so this stood out. I rubbed my arms and kept walking, but my mind replayed the moment from my first odd ride. I remembered the quiet tension in that enclosed box, the flicker of the overhead light, and the faint impression of another figure behind me. Sometimes I wondered if it was all just a product of my imagination. I was tired, the place was old, and I knew the building had a long history. The hallway walls were covered with old bulletin boards, each pinned with outdated flyers. The atmosphere could feel eerie after hours, especially on a campus so focused on discipline and order. Yet I knew my reaction had been more physical than mental. My heart raced, my palms got sweaty, and my neck tingled. It was more than a casual spook. In the weeks that followed, I heard a rumor or two about people claiming the dorm was haunted. I never brought up my elevator experience, though. I didn't want to be the person who fed the gossip, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I believed in anything supernatural. I just felt that the elevator gave off a strange vibe. Each night, when I walked by it on the way to my room, I noticed my steps got quicker and my eyes flicked toward the doors. I half expected them to open on their own, revealing that sterile glow inside, inviting me in. That never happened. The elevator stayed shut unless someone pressed the button. I occasionally saw maintenance workers step in or out, carrying cleaning supplies. They never seemed bothered by it. Once, I tried to ask one of them if the elevator had any problems, like flickering lights or weird noises. He just shrugged, said he'd never noticed anything. He even joked that the elevator was one of the best maintained in the building, thanks to low usage. Despite those reassurances, I couldn't fully ignore the memory. Late at night, I sometimes dreamed I was trapped in that elevator, pressing the door open button repeatedly while the overhead light blinked in and out, showing strange shapes in the mirror. I'd wake up in a sweat, my heart pounding, convinced for a moment that it was real. Then I'd see my familiar dorm ceiling and try to calm down. As time passed, I managed to push the incident to the back of my thoughts, focusing on exams and social life. I started using the elevator again during the day, as long as I wasn't alone. If a couple of classmates were with me, the tension felt weaker. I never told them about my discomfort. I pretended it was just laziness. But inside, each ride stirred a small knot in my stomach. A full semester went by without any major incidents. The elevator never malfunctioned again. I never saw that extra shape in the mirror. Yet the sense that something had happened lingered. Sometimes, after a long day, I'd take the stairs to avoid the risk of riding alone. Other times, I'd wait until someone else entered the elevator so I could slip in with them. If I did ride alone, I found myself staring at the floor buttons instead of looking in the mirror. I felt safer not seeing my reflection. I finished that academic year without further trouble. My grades were decent, and I was set to move out for the summer. On my last night in the dorm, I stood outside my room, holding boxes of clothes and books, ready to leave in the morning. I passed by the elevator once more. The doors were closed, the panels light off because no one was using it. The hallway was silent. I paused for a second. My heartbeat sped up as I recalled the first time the doors had sealed behind me, the overhead lamp flickering. I felt a brief wave of unease, but then I shook my head. I reminded myself that it was just an elevator. People used it every day. I never mentioned my experience to anyone in the dorm. It became a private memory, one that I sometimes doubted. Maybe if I'd told someone, they would have shared a similar story. Maybe not. Either way, I never found an explanation for that flicker of light or the reflection that seemed off. The mystery remains. Even now, I sometimes think about that cold glow and the smooth silence of the elevator's interior. It taught me that anxiety can surface in the most ordinary places. A simple ride between floors can leave you with your heart pounding, unsure if you actually saw something in that mirror, or if it was just your mind conjuring shadows. And that small doubt is enough to leave you uneasy, long after the doors have opened. Lift notifications kept appearing on my phone the night I decided to open that new social media account. I had been bored, so I accepted friend requests without much caution. Most were harmless, people interested in quick chats about music or local events. Then I noticed a request from someone named Rob. His profile picture was a generic snapshot of a random street corner, nothing personal. I felt a small twinge of unease, but I accepted it anyway. My excitement for meeting new online friends overrode my caution. At first, Rob's messages seemed ordinary. We talked about favorite bands, local restaurants, and the area where I lived. He mentioned a few interesting places I had never heard of, so it seemed like he was from nearby. But he also asked for the exact street I lived on. My stomach knotted a bit. I told him the general neighborhood, being careful not to reveal my address. He didn't push for more. That made me feel slightly safer, so I brushed off any concerns. A few days passed, and our chats continued. He asked about my schedule, when I usually left for work, which grocery store I favored, and what time I got home. I felt a prickle of worry. I told myself he was probably just trying to see if we could meet up sometime, but each question carried a slight edge, as if he was cataloging my routine. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave half-truths, never the full picture. One evening, I was about to log off when a private message from Rob popped up. He asked if we could meet for coffee. He said he wanted to discuss some music recommendations in person. My intuition flared. Something told me it was too soon. I hesitated, then typed back that I wasn't comfortable meeting yet. He sent a quick reply. "No problem, maybe another time." That response was calm, even polite, so I felt relieved. However, my stomach still felt tense, like I had dodged something uncomfortable. Over the next week, our messages grew more personal on his side. He wanted to know what time I usually went to bed, which bus line I took, and whether I lived alone. I avoided giving direct answers. I changed the subject or responded vaguely. He didn't seem angry, but he didn't let go of these inquiries either. My hands grew sweaty whenever I saw his username pop up on my screen. A few nights later, around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps on the sidewalk outside my window. My home is on a quiet street where not many people wander at that hour. I peeked through a small gap in the curtains. Under the dim streetlight, I saw a figure standing on the far side of the road. I couldn't see the person's face, and they didn't do anything threatening. They just stood there, hands in pockets, glancing around. After a minute, they walked away. I tried to tell myself it was just a random passerby, but my pulse thumped hard. I had a persistent thought. Could that be Rob? I decided to reduce my presence on social media for a while. I logged out of that new account and kept my phone on silent. That helped me relax a bit. But one afternoon, I realized I had new emails in the same tone as Rob's messages. He must have found my personal email address. I couldn't recall giving it to him, so maybe he dug around online. The messages weren't outright threatening, but they referenced places I'd been recently, implying he knew more about my movements than I was comfortable with. My stomach twisted whenever I read them. I replied to one email, politely asking him to stop following me online. He wrote back, saying he was just curious and wanted to know me better. I typed a short response. "I'm not interested. Please respect my privacy." His next email arrived an hour later, shorter and with a sharper tone. He wrote, "If you don't want to meet, that's your choice. Just remember that some opportunities don't come twice." My hands shook as I read it. I stared at those words, trying to decide if it was a threat or if I was reading too much into it. That night, I double-checked my door and window locks. My heart pounded each time I heard the house's normal creaks. Around midnight, I glanced out the window again. The street was empty, only a stray cat skulking around. I tried to calm myself, telling myself Rob had no reason to appear here in person. Still, my mouth felt dry, and I kept imagining I saw shadows moving along the fences. I blocked his email address and decided to delete the social media account altogether. I hoped that would be the end of it. For a few days, I felt peace. No new messages, no suspicious figures on my street. My breathing started to return to normal, and I thought maybe he had given up. Then a new account under a name I didn't recognize popped up in my inbox. The email address looked random, and the subject line just said, "Hello." The style of writing inside sounded exactly like Rob's, asking if I'd reconsider meeting up. He mentioned a store I had visited the previous day, describing it as though he'd seen me there. Panic rippled through me. I remembered that store, an artsy boutique where I had stopped to look at some handmade pottery. It was small, and I hadn't noticed anyone staring. But now I wondered if he had been nearby, watching me shop. I felt violated. I called a close friend and explained the situation, speaking in a hushed voice. She urged me to gather any evidence and consider informing the police. But I had no direct threats, just uncomfortable hints. I promised I'd keep track of the messages, though I worried the authorities wouldn't take me seriously without an explicit threat. Meanwhile, I checked my locks again and even bought a cheap security camera to attach near the front door. The next day, I found a short letter in my physical mailbox. The envelope had no return address, and inside was a plain sheet of paper that said, "Still hoping to see you around." My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. The realization that someone had taken the time to place this letter in my mailbox drove my anxiety through the roof. That meant they knew my exact address, not just the general neighborhood. My mind scrambled with questions. How long had they followed me? Which day did they figure out my house? And what else did they know? I spent the rest of that day looking out the window every half hour, expecting to see a stranger loitering. Nobody appeared. The sense of dread built up anyway. My phone stayed in my pocket, and every chime made me jump. I worried Rob, or whoever was behind these messages, would ramp up their efforts to contact me. My hands shook when I tried to concentrate on cooking dinner. I dropped a plate, shattering it on the floor, cursing out loud as shards scattered. That evening, I scrolled through the new social media connections I had made. I recognized none of them as real-life acquaintances. Half of the accounts looked generic, with barely any posts. I realized I had been careless in my eagerness for online interaction. I made a list of suspicious profiles and blocked them all, hoping to sever any link they might have to my personal life. A wave of anger and fear washed over me as I clicked block again and again. Sleep was difficult. My mind replayed each detail: the email, the mailbox note, the silhouette on the street. My thoughts churned with scenarios of someone grabbing me outside my home or confronting me at the grocery store. My body was tense, and every small creak in the house made me bolt upright. I felt cornered in my own space. The next morning, I gathered what little evidence I had: screenshots of emails, the letter, the times I thought I saw someone on my street. I took them to the local station. The officer at the desk listened politely, but I sensed his skepticism. He asked if the messages contained explicit threats. I had to admit they didn't. He told me to remain vigilant, suggested I could get a restraining order if I identified the person, and advised me to document any further incidents. I left feeling unsettled, but at least I had begun a paper trail. Days went by without new emails or letters. The tension in my stomach lingered, yet I started to hope that blocking all those accounts and talking to the police had deterred Rob. I tried to resume normal routines, went back to my favorite coffee shop, walked around the neighborhood when I felt restless. I stayed alert, looking for anyone who resembled the blurry image I had in my head of Rob. No one matched, and for a while I felt safer. But each night, I made sure to lock my doors meticulously. I avoided checking the mailbox until broad daylight. My appetite was off, and I spent too much time scanning the windows for strange cars. My close friends supported me, telling me I'd done all I could. One friend even stayed over a couple of nights, noticing how jumpy I was at every sound. She tried to lighten the mood, but I couldn't fully relax. Eventually, I realized I hadn't heard from Rob or any suspicious email account for nearly a month. I started to breathe easier. My shoulders felt less tense. I figured maybe he lost interest after failing to push me into meeting him. I uninstalled that new social media app entirely. Life began to feel more ordinary. I even slept better, though I still woke at the slightest noise. Every now and then, I catch myself double-checking whether someone follows me in public or if a stranger lingers too long outside my home. That fear never fully left me. Even simple things, like going out to the local park, carry a hint of anxiety now. I keep my phone close, ready to call someone if I feel threatened. Looking back, the real horror wasn't a single violent act. It was the gradual intrusion into my everyday life, someone prying into my routines, leaving me with a lingering sense of vulnerability. The lack of a direct threat in the messages made the situation feel both less urgent and more unsettling. There was nothing the police could do with half hints, and there was nothing I could do except cut off contact, hoping that would suffice. I still don't know who Rob really was, or if he was even the one standing on my street that night. I've learned to be careful with my personal information online, double-checking who I connect with. My friends joked that I became the privacy freak of the group, but I take that as a compliment. Better safe than sorry. When the mailbox stands empty and my inbox remains free of suspicious emails, I feel a quiet relief. But a part of me stays on edge, knowing that someone who was that persistent once might return under a different name, a different profile, or a different approach. That lingering doubt is what keeps my guard up. It's not a paralyzing fear anymore, but it's a reminder of how quickly a casual online chat can escalate into something unnerving. And in the end, I'd rather be cautious than revisit that sense of dread. Rigid sunlight fell through the restaurant's front window that evening when I spotted Sandy sitting at a small table. I recognized her from high school. She had the same short hair, though her face looked more composed now. We hadn't been close back then, so I felt a mix of curiosity and unease when she messaged me out of nowhere, suggesting we meet for dinner. I agreed mainly because I had free time, and I wondered what she'd been up to since graduation. I walked over to the table and gave her a small wave. She nodded, not exactly smiling, but her expression wasn't unfriendly. She looked around the restaurant, then gestured for me to sit. The place was quiet, with only a few other diners scattered around. The walls were dull beige, and the overhead lights gave off a weak yellow glow. I took the chair across from her, feeling the cool surface of the seat beneath me. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice low. I heard a slight catch in her tone, like she wasn't used to talking much. We picked up the menus. The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the clink of silverware from the other tables. Sandy cleared her throat and asked if I remembered some teacher we both had in junior year. We made a bit of small talk about high school. I tried to steer the conversation toward what she'd done over the years, but her answers were short, sometimes just one or two words. Her eyes drifted away whenever I pressed for details about her life. I noticed my shoulders tightening, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't like she was being rude, she was just distant. After the waiter took our orders, I asked if everything was all right. She paused, drew a slow breath, and said she was fine. She kept glancing at me with this look that I couldn't read. It wasn't anger or sadness, it was more like she was evaluating me. I felt my stomach tense up, and I realized I was gripping my napkin too tightly. I tried to ease my grip, but my hand stayed stiff. Our food arrived. I had chosen something simple, just a chicken dish with vegetables. She had a small salad. We ate mostly in silence. I attempted to start a few topics, the city, the weather, any mutual acquaintances, but she gave minimal responses. The tension around us felt heavier than the normal awkwardness of an old classmate reunion. At one point, I heard the scrape of her fork against the plate, and I noticed my pulse quicken. Her movements were neither fast nor slow. They were calm, almost mechanical. When we finished eating, she suggested we have coffee at her place. My first instinct was to decline, but her voice had a certain flat calmness that made me reconsider. I thought maybe she just felt self-conscious in a public setting. Maybe she was more comfortable in a familiar environment. I agreed, but the uneasiness in my gut deepened. We walked a few blocks. The streets were only half lit by small street lamps. I followed her to a modest house with a short walkway leading to the door. She unlocked it and let me in. The living room was neat, with sparse furniture. A low table sat in front of a simple couch. The walls were painted a pale green, and an old clock ticked from a corner. I noticed the air felt stuffy, like the windows hadn't been opened all day. She told me to sit while she made coffee. Her tone was polite but lacked warmth. I sank into the couch, trying to relax. A single lamp in the corner cast a soft glow. My eyes wandered around the room. Everything seemed orderly. No clutter, no personal photos. The only item that caught my attention was a tall floor lamp with a faintly yellowish bulb, which created oddly elongated shadows on the walls. I waited, listening for the sounds of her prepping coffee in the kitchen. I heard the water running, then nothing. I called out, asking if she needed help, but she didn't answer. A minute later, the water ran again, then stopped. My tension grew. I found myself tapping my foot on the carpet. The house was too silent. Even the clock's ticking felt faint. The quiet created a heavy feeling in my chest. Another minute passed. She still didn't return with the coffee. I stood up, deciding to check on her. When I reached the doorway to the kitchen, I saw her at the counter, facing away. She wasn't moving. "Sandy?" I asked. She turned around slowly, her face unreadable. She said she forgot the sugar. Her voice was low, almost monotone. My pulse jumped at the small shock of her abrupt turn. She gestured for me to go back to the living room. I nodded, forcing a small smile. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. My skin prickled. I glanced at the corner of the room where the lamp made that stretch of shadow across the wall, and it almost looked like a figure standing there. I blinked, realizing it was just the shape of a chair. I rubbed my palms on my pants, noticing they were damp from sweat. A few more minutes ticked by. Still no coffee. I stood up again and took a slow breath. The desire to leave rose in my gut, strong and urgent. But I hesitated, worried it would be rude to walk out. I forced myself to stay put, reminding myself we were just two old classmates trying to reconnect. Maybe she felt nervous, yet my heart thumped with every second. Finally, she stepped into the living room, empty-handed. She walked right past the low table and stood close to me, invading my personal space. Her expression was blank, and her eyes locked onto mine in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I noticed her breathing was steady, but the lack of blinking unsettled me. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost as if she were asking a mundane question. I swallowed, feeling my throat go dry. I admitted that it was getting late and I had an early morning. She didn't protest or try to stop me. Instead, she moved a step to the side, clearing my path to the door. I nodded, muttered a thanks for the invite, and started toward the exit. She followed behind me, not speaking. At the door, I paused and glanced over my shoulder. She was just a foot away, staring. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my temples. She reached for the doorknob before I could. The door opened with a smooth click, and cool outside air drifted in. I stepped through and she stayed on the threshold. No warm farewell, just that same watching look. I forced myself to say goodbye. She gave a small tilt of her head, not quite a nod. The instant I was outside, I felt a surge of relief, but my chest stayed tight. I walked down the short path to the sidewalk. I didn't hear the door close until I was halfway to my car. When it finally shut, it did so with a near-silent thud, no slam or click. That almost unsettled me more. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there a moment, trying to calm my breathing. My fingers trembled. My mind replayed each moment in her house, the stagnant air, the low lamp, the odd shadows, her silent presence. I turned the key, and the engine's hum grounded me in reality. Driving away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her outside, watching me. The street remained empty. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, expressionless and close to mine. I woke up several times, soaked in sweat, heart racing. I told myself it might be simple anxiety. Maybe she was just awkward and I had overreacted. But some part of me remained disturbed by the feeling that there had been more tension in the air than just social discomfort. Over the next few days, I tried to get back to my routine. I went to work, ran errands, and met friends for dinner. I didn't mention Sandy to anyone at first. I felt uneasy bringing it up because I couldn't name anything explicitly bad that happened. But the memory wouldn't leave me. My muscles tensed if I recalled the moment she stood there, silent, inches away, or how she never brought out the coffee she'd said she'd make. Eventually, a friend asked about my week, and I mentioned meeting an old classmate. I kept the story brief, describing the dinner and the awkward vibe. My friend gave me a perplexed look, then said maybe Sandy was dealing with personal issues. I nodded. Maybe that was it. But something told me there was more going on, something I couldn't label or explain. All I knew was that I felt genuine fear for reasons I couldn't articulate. After a week passed, I texted Sandy a short message, asking how she was doing. She didn't respond. I waited a day or two, then tried again. Still no answer. I felt a mix of relief and concern. A small voice in my head told me to just let it go, not to dig deeper. Another part of me felt guilty for abandoning the contact after sensing her strange behavior, but the discomfort in my stomach flared every time I thought about stepping back into that house. Sometimes at night, I found myself wondering if she sat in that living room, with those distorted shadows on the wall, as silent as she had been. The image made my chest tighten. I checked the locks on my own doors and windows, even though I lived in a different neighborhood. Each time I considered going back to see her, a wave of apprehension stopped me. I didn't want to be alone with her again in that strange, silent space. Months passed, and life moved on. I never heard from Sandy again. No calls, no texts, no emails. I told myself it was for the best, that we had nothing in common now. Yet I sometimes recalled that dinner at the restaurant, the odd breaks in conversation, the feeling that she was watching me with a hidden motive. The memory of her quiet intensity still caused my heart to speed up if I dwelled on it too long. That lingering sense of disquiet taught me that not all unsettling experiences come from overt threats or loud confrontations. Sometimes it's the quiet, tense interactions that leave the deepest marks. In that house, with the coffee never made and her expression never shifting, I felt a type of fear I couldn't place, an awareness that something wasn't right, even though I lacked proof. I still drive by that part of town now and then. I've never seen her on the sidewalk or in a nearby store. Sometimes I wonder if she moved away. Sometimes I wonder if she still sits in that living room, lights off, waiting for guests who never arrive. And I catch myself feeling relieved that I don't have a reason to visit again. Brisk footsteps echoed in my hallway one evening as I returned from work. The place was silent otherwise. I flipped on the living room light and immediately noticed a slight shift in how my things were arranged. I saw a framed photo on the shelf that had been moved half an inch. Normally, it sat flush with the edge of the shelf. Now, it was just off-center. It was such a small change that no casual observer would have noticed. My throat went dry. I felt my pulse jump. I had been living under a cloud of tension since my breakup a few months before. My ex-partner and I had parted on bad terms, with unresolved issues about shared belongings and finances. Our interactions after the breakup had stayed civil on the surface, but she had a way of making me doubt my own judgment. Nothing she did was illegal, yet everything felt intrusive. I had found messages on my phone referencing details I hadn't told her. Sometimes, items in my house seemed out of place, though there was no sign of forced entry. It was all subtle enough that I couldn't prove anything. That night, seeing the shifted frame felt like more of the same. My chest tightened. I swallowed, scanning the room for other irregularities. The lamp on the side table was angled differently. A stack of papers on the coffee table looked rummaged. My stomach churned. There were no broken windows or damaged locks, so I told myself it might be my imagination. But I couldn't ignore the sinking sense that someone had been there. I checked the door. It was locked, as I'd left it. The windows were all latched. Nothing was missing, at least not that I could see. My mind raced. I felt a bead of sweat at my temple. Was it possible I had left things this way in the morning? My memory told me otherwise, but doubt crept in. That was her specialty, sowing confusion. I exhaled shakily, tried to calm my nerves, and told myself to stay alert. Days later, more small incidents occurred. I'd come home to find a cupboard door slightly open, or a closet light switched on when I was certain I'd left it off. Often I found cryptic texts on my phone, lines of words that echoed random conversations from our relationship. Nothing direct. They would just say things like, "Remember that day in the park?" or "You always leave your closet light on." I felt a jolt each time I saw these. My fingers shook as I read them. I could hardly focus on my routine. In the mornings, I rushed through breakfast, glancing at the windows to be sure no one was standing outside. At night, I triple-checked the locks. One afternoon, I stood in my kitchen, my phone on the counter, debating whether to call the police. But what would I tell them? I had no concrete evidence. The texts came from numbers I didn't recognize, and none of them contained direct threats. The house didn't show signs of a break-in. The law couldn't do much about subtle psychological pressure. My frustration built, making me feel trapped in my own home. I talked to a close friend, trying to describe the situation. He asked if I was sure I wasn't just overthinking. I felt a surge of annoyance, but I knew it was a fair question. The entire scenario was built on hints and suggestions. Nothing tangible pointed to my ex being the cause, just my gut and the pattern of manipulative behavior she'd displayed before. My friend advised me to keep notes of everything strange that happened, to build a record. So I started documenting. Each day, I jotted down any odd details. Monday, kitchen shelf items rearranged slightly, or Tuesday, Message from unknown number referencing old inside joke. I kept these notes in a locked drawer. Every time I added a new entry, my stomach twisted. I hated seeing how frequent the incidents were. Reading them back made me anxious, but at least I felt like I was taking some control. One late evening, I heard light knocks on my back door. My heart lurched. The knock sounded almost hesitant, like someone testing if I was there. I froze, phone in hand, stepping softly across the living room. I peeked through a slit in the blinds. The porch light was off, so I couldn't see much. When I heard a second set of knocks, I mustered enough courage to call out, "Who's there?" No response. A cold sweat trickled down my back. I stood there for a few more seconds, heartbeat hammering. Eventually, I heard footsteps moving away on the grass. I didn't open the door. My mind spun with possibilities, each one more nerve-wracking. After that incident, I bought a small security camera and mounted it discreetly near the back entrance. I also placed one at the front door. Setting them up made my hands tremble, but I felt a bit safer knowing I'd have some record if someone tried that again. I checked them every morning. Often, I saw nothing unusual. That was almost worse. It left me scanning each recording, expecting a figure to appear in the shadows. A few nights later, I was woken up by the sound of a floorboard creaking in the hallway. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it would burst out of my chest. I lay in bed, holding my breath. Then I heard it again, softer this time. I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend's number, whispering that I thought someone was in my house. He told me to call the police immediately. Summoning courage, I inched toward the bedroom door. I listened. Silence. My body shook, but I didn't hear footsteps. I called the police. They arrived and checked the property. They found no one inside and no sign of forced entry. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. After they left, I sat on the couch, too jittery to go back to bed. In the following days, I scaled back my work hours. My mind wasn't fully present at the office anyway. I spent more time at home, thinking if that would discourage intrusions. But each time I heard a creak or a distant rustle, my adrenaline surged. The phone messages continued, though not every day. Sometimes they were completely nonsensical, just a single line from an old argument or a random date. Other times, they would reference an object in my house like, "You still have that blue vase?" The confusion made my head spin. I kept telling myself I had no proof it was her, but my gut believed it was. One evening, I checked my front security camera footage. The timestamp showed 2:14 a.m. A figure appeared at the edge of the screen for a moment, then stepped back out of view. It was too dark to see features, but I could tell they wore dark clothing. They seemed to be looking at my front door. My chest tightened as I replayed the clip. They didn't try the door, didn't knock, didn't ring the bell. They just stood there for a moment, then left. I felt nauseous. I saved the file and wondered if it was enough to go to the police. They might say there was no actual crime. Still, I put it on a flash drive. My nerves were shot. I found it hard to sleep. My chest felt tight, and some nights I ended up pacing in the living room until dawn. Whenever I did manage to sleep, I woke with my jaw clenched, tension throbbing in my temples. My friend came over a few times to keep me company, and I felt calmer for a short while, but then I'd find another minor change in the house, a drawer left slightly open, or a document on my desk turned upside down. Each time it happened, my heart felt like it might explode. I tried texting my ex directly, asking if we could settle whatever issues remained. She replied with polite confusion, asking why I was accusing her. She said she had nothing to do with my problems, and maybe I should see a therapist about my paranoia. Her words made my blood boil, but also caused a surge of doubt. What if she was telling the truth? Could someone else be responsible? My head spun, and I had no clear answers. As the days passed, the tension didn't lessen. The texts kept coming, though sometimes there would be a gap of several days. The house still showed tiny signs of intrusion or manipulation. I rarely found definitive evidence, but enough small details piled up to keep me on edge. I considered moving, but that felt extreme. Instead, I installed extra locks and motion-activated lights outside. Late one afternoon, I found another piece of paper slipped under my front door. It had a single sentence, "You're not safe." The handwriting was blocky, not her usual script. My hands shook as I read it. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to scream or call someone, but I just stood there, rooted to the spot. This was the closest thing to an actual threat, yet it was still vague. I took photos, bagged the note in a plastic sleeve, and drove to the police station. The officer on duty looked sympathetic, but the note lacked direct references. They told me to stay vigilant. I recognized the same polite detachment in their voice, as if they saw no immediate way to help. After that note, I spent a few nights at my friend's place. I felt a bit safer, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. I went back home eventually, installed more sensors, and tried to live normally. The texts dwindled for a while. Then I got one more. "I think you finally learned your lesson." My heart pounded. That same day, I discovered a single muddy footprint by the side door. The shape suggested someone had stood there, leaning against the wall. My nerves ignited again. But after that, nothing happened for weeks. I never got closure. The incident stopped abruptly. The texts stopped too. For a while, I kept expecting the next small violation. But the house stayed as I left it. My phone remained silent, aside from normal calls and messages. No new footprints or random items moved. I felt relief mixed with leftover anxiety. My sleeping patterns remained poor, but I slowly calmed down. I still jumped at minor noises, but each day without a new disruption helped me relax a bit more. In the end, I never discovered who was behind it or what their goal was. The police found no concrete leads. My ex denied involvement, and I couldn't prove otherwise. I had to accept that my peace of mind had been fractured by a campaign of subtle intimidation. Even now, I double-check my locks every time I leave. My house doesn't feel as safe as it once did. Sometimes I wake up at night and listen for unfamiliar sounds. Sometimes I catch myself staring at that framed photo on the shelf, recalling the day I noticed it was out of place. A few inches of difference was all it took to send me down a path of fear. That is how I live now, cautious and on guard, waiting for a sign that the intrusions might start again. I hold on to a faint hope that it was all just a twisted game that ended for good. But the lingering doubt never leaves. The memory of that tension keeps my nerves alert, reminding me that not all threats come with loud announcements. Sometimes it's the quiet disruptions that wear you down the most, one tiny detail at a time. Harsh wind rattled the window panes on the night I heard the first knocks at my door. It was around 11, and I was already in my pajamas. I hadn't invited anyone over, and my neighborhood was usually quiet after dark. The knocks weren't loud, but they were solid enough to jolt me from a half-doze on the couch. I muted the TV and stood there, heart thumping. 3 knocks again, then silence. I went to the peephole. The porch light was off, and I couldn't see a figure. My pulse picked up. I thought about calling out, but something made me hesitate. After a few seconds, I slowly turned the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. Cold air rushed in. There was no one on the small concrete porch. just the dark street beyond. My yard was barely visible in the dim glow of a distant streetlight. I stepped outside, barefoot on the cold concrete. I looked left and right, seeing only empty yards and a row of dark houses. My breath came out in short puffs. No one lurked near the gate, and I didn't see any movement in the shadowy corners. I felt uneasy, so I stepped back in and locked the door. My heart was still pounding. I told myself it was probably kids messing around, or maybe the wind had caused something to knock against the door. But I hadn't heard a gust strong enough to explain it. Either way, I went to bed with a knot in my stomach. The next morning, I checked the porch in daylight. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no marks. The sense of unease from the previous night faded a bit under the sun. I went about my day, ran errands, and by evening, I'd mostly shrugged off the memory. Then, 3 days later, I heard something in my backyard. It was about 10 at night, and I was cleaning the kitchen after a late dinner. A faint scraping sound came from somewhere near the side fence. I turned off the faucet and listened, my heartbeat accelerating. The scrape repeated, like someone was moving along the fence. I switched off the kitchen light, hoping to see better outside. Through the window, I could make out the shape of my small backyard and a few of the bushes. No silhouette. The sound stopped. I waited, body tense. Nothing else happened. I left the light off and stood there for a few minutes, my pulse hammering. Eventually, I told myself it might have been a stray cat or a piece of debris blown by the wind. Still, I couldn't relax. I double-checked the back door lock and moved to the living room, where I sat with the TV muted again, ears straining for more noise. None came. By midnight, I forced myself to go to bed, but I slept fitfully. A week passed without incident. I started to think maybe those noises were coincidences. One evening, I was reading in bed around 10:30 when I heard distinct knocks at the front door again. This time, 4 quick raps, like someone with a knuckle or a small object. My stomach flipped. My bedroom is at the back of the house, so I had to cross the hallway and living room to reach the door. I approached as quietly as I could, adrenaline surging in my veins. I glanced out the window by the door but saw only the dark street. The knocks repeated, sharper now. I reached for the knob but stopped. My mind raced. If it was someone in trouble, wouldn't they call out? If it was a friend, they would have texted or used the doorbell. Why knock like that? I stayed still, holding my breath. Eventually, the knocking stopped. After a minute of silence, I peered through the peephole again. No one was there. My heart hammered as I flipped on the porch light and opened the door a few inches, scanning the yard. Empty. I stepped onto the porch, my bare feet hitting the chilly concrete again. The street was deserted. No cars passing, no shadows moving. I noticed my mouth was dry. I called a soft, "Hello?" into the night, but got no answer. I locked the door, feeling a surge of anxiety. My mind raced with possibilities, a prank, a neighbor with a strange sense of humor, or something more sinister. I felt a chill even though the temperature inside was comfortable. I decided to leave a lamp on in the living room as I tried to go to bed. For the next few nights, I kept the porch light on and occasionally looked out the window, checking if someone was there. No knocks came. I let my guard down again. On a Saturday night, I heard soft steps in my side yard around midnight. It wasn't quite footsteps, more like a gentle crunching on the gravel path. I jumped off the couch, switching off the TV to listen. My pulse raced. I stood near the side window but stayed back from the glass. The yard was dark, lit only by a faint glow from the distant streetlight. I couldn't see movement, but the gravel crackled like someone shifting their weight. I suddenly regretted not installing motion lights on that side. My hands trembled, debating if I should call the police. I had no real evidence of a threat, just unexplained noises. My phone was in my pocket, so I held it tightly. Another few seconds passed, then silence. I heard nothing else. If someone was there, they either left or stood very still. After a minute, I turned on the side yard light from the switch. The sudden glow revealed only the path, the fence, and the bushes. No one was visible. My heart pounded. I eased the curtain open an inch, scanning every corner. Nothing. I tried to sleep, but every small crack or pop in the house made me jump. By morning, I was drained. I stepped outside and carefully checked the gravel. No obvious footprints, though it's not easy to see them on small stones. I walked around the house, looking for any sign of tampering. Nothing. Neighbors I spoke to hadn't noticed anything strange, but they said they'd keep an eye out. A few nights later, about an hour after sundown, I was in the living room when I heard 3 slow knocks on the front door. My heart lurched again. This time, I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek. The porch light was on, and I could see the silhouette of a person standing there. They stood close to the door but slightly to the side, like they didn't want to be framed by the peephole. The shape looked medium in height, wearing dark clothes. No immediate details. I didn't recognize them. My stomach churned. I considered shouting through the door, but fear kept me mute. After maybe 10 seconds, the figure moved off the porch, stepping out of the light. I saw a quick glimpse of the side of a hooded sweatshirt. Then the person disappeared into the darkness. My hands shook as I flipped off the lamp inside. I watched from the window, searching for movement on the sidewalk. The figure never reappeared. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? Someone knocked and left. No crime. Still, I dialed the non-emergency number, explained I had a suspicious individual knocking late at night and lingering. They said they'd send a patrol car around the area. I thanked them, then sat in my dark living room for half an hour, tense and listening. When a patrol car finally passed by, I felt a bit better, but I knew the person was probably gone by then. At this point, I was on edge daily. My appetite shrank, and I found myself checking the front window repeatedly. I installed a simple security camera above the porch, aiming at the front steps. Setting it up gave me some comfort, though my hands trembled on the ladder. For a week or two, everything stayed quiet. Then, on a cold Friday, I got home from work and found a single muddy footprint near my door. It was faint, but clearly not my shoe size. I felt a wave of dread. Reviewing my camera footage that night, I saw no one approaching the door in the last 24 hours. That made no sense. The footprint was there, but the camera missed the visitor. Could the system have malfunctioned? The next evening, around 10, I heard knocks again. This time, I jumped up and raced to my monitor, checking the live feed. Nothing showed on the porch, yet the knocking continued, clear as day. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I stared at the screen, seeing only the empty doorstep. My heart hammered. Finally, the knocks stopped. I replayed the clip. There was no one there. My mind reeled. Was it a glitch in the camera? Was I losing it? I spent that night half awake, replaying the sound in my head. By morning, I had a headache from lack of sleep. I went outside to see if there were new footprints or signs, but the porch looked clean except for the old trace of mud. I even tested the camera by walking back and forth. It recorded me perfectly. So why did it fail to show the knocks from the previous night? For another week, I lived in a tense haze. No new knocks, no new footprints, just the memory of unexplained sounds and glimpses. My friends tried to reassure me, suggesting I might be stressed or overreacting. But I knew what I heard, and I had seen that figure at least once. The camera glitch still bothered me. I reset it, updated the software, and tested it again. It seemed fine. Finally, one night, around midnight, I heard those knocks again. 3 steady raps on the front door. I scrambled to the monitor. The porch feed was clear. My heart pounded as the knocks persisted, louder this time. I wanted to yell or call 911, but a kind of dread pinned me in place. Then, after maybe 6 or 7 knocks in total, it went silent. My throat felt tight. I crept to the window, but there was no shape under the light. I turned the volume on the camera feed all the way up. Just faint static. No sign of anyone there. I stood frozen for a few minutes, trying to calm my shaking hands. Eventually, I mustered enough courage to look outside. The yard was deserted. No sign of footprints, no tracks in the dirt, nothing. I felt lightheaded from the surge of fear and confusion. I called the non-emergency line again, and they told me they would send a car by, same as before. The officer arrived, checked around, and found nothing suspicious. I thanked him, apologizing for any hassle. Over the following days, I realized the knocks seemed to come randomly, without a set pattern. Sometimes weeks passed without an incident. Sometimes I'd hear them twice in the same week. My security camera never caught a single person on the porch, though it worked fine when I tested it. It was as if the knocks belonged to a different reality that my camera couldn't pick up. The stress weighed heavily on me. I lost sleep, found it hard to concentrate at work, and constantly dreaded sunset. One evening, I decided to sit on the porch in the dark, hoping to catch whoever was doing this. I turned off all the house lights, set the camera to record, and waited. A few hours passed, and nothing happened. My legs got stiff, and my neck ached from tension. Eventually, I went inside, feeling foolish. The knocks didn't come that night. I felt both relieved and frustrated. Months have gone by, and I still live with the memory of those unexplained knocks. They haven't occurred recently, but I can't forget them. I still glance at the porch camera feed every evening, half expecting to see that shadowy figure appear. When the wind picks up or I hear a random thud, my heart races for a moment until I confirm it's just the wind or an old house creak. I never found clear answers. The police suggested it might be a prank or a wandering individual with odd timing. My friends blamed my nerves or said it could be random kids. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something else was at play. I remember the times the knocks came, the figure I briefly saw, the silence on the camera. It all left me with a tension in my chest that never fully goes away, even now. And every so often, late at night, I find myself pausing, listening carefully for any faint tapping on the door, wondering if it will start again without warning. Rigid silence often fell over the dinner table whenever someone in my family hinted at the old houses we used to live in. From the time I was a child, I noticed how the adults would suddenly lower their voices or clear their throats when the topic came up. There were no dramatic stories of ghosts or cursed rooms, just quiet remarks about a certain closet or a crawl space nobody liked to enter. Whenever I asked questions, I got vague answers. My grandparents and older relatives usually changed the subject, and my parents did the same. That made me curious, even when I was too young to understand much. Growing up, I realized our family moved more than most people I knew. We never stayed in one house for more than a few years. Sometimes we left after only a few months. My father always said it was because of work or finances, but I noticed patterns. He and my mother often seemed uneasy in each new place, especially if it had corners that felt cramped or extra rooms that went unused. They would talk softly at night, their voices tense. I sometimes heard them mention hearing odd sounds or feeling strange drafts, but they never gave me a clear explanation. When I was around 10, we lived in a 2-story house with narrow windows and a dark attic. One afternoon, my grandmother came to visit. I heard her ask my mother, "Have you checked the far corner of the attic yet?" My mother shook her head and said she would get around to it later, then changed the subject. I listened from the staircase, heart beating faster for no obvious reason. It was an attic, after all. Why would it matter? But there was a slight tremor in my grandmother's voice that told me it mattered to her. I tried to go up there once. The attic was musty, and the single light bulb flickered in a way that made me feel uneasy. The insulation on the floor made everything look dusty and lumpy. I only lasted a few minutes before I got spooked by a weird creak in the rafters. I ran back downstairs, my pulse racing, telling myself it was just old wood settling. My parents did not scold me for going up there, but they asked if I found anything unusual. I shook my head, and they seemed relieved. Eventually, we left that house and moved to another not far away. My father said it was for a job change, but I overheard my mother telling him that something felt off in that house. She mentioned hearing movement in the walls at night. My father muttered that we should keep that to ourselves, and we ended up packing everything within a few weeks. The new place was an older building too, but with larger windows. I remember hoping it would feel more open. It did, for a while. By the time I was 16, I had lost track of how many houses we had lived in. Each had its own quirks, floors that creaked in patterns, hallways that seemed darker than normal, or crawl spaces that made the air feel stale. My mother once told me that these things were normal in older homes, but I wasn't convinced. The tension in her shoulders and the worried lines on my father's face said otherwise. It felt like our family was chasing a sense of safety we could never find. During a family gathering, I noticed a few older relatives whispering in the corner of the living room. They glanced my way a few times. After the gathering, I asked my uncle if the family had a history of strange events. He looked uncomfortable and said that our ancestors had always ended up in houses with unpleasant atmospheres. He didn't elaborate. He patted my shoulder and said not to worry about it. That only made me more curious. I started watching family members closely. I saw how they avoided certain topics and how their eyes sometimes flicked to doorways or ceilings as if expecting something. One year, we moved into a house on a quiet street with a wide front yard. I felt optimistic at first. The place had large, airy rooms and plenty of sunlight. But the basement was dim and oddly laid out, with narrow passages that led nowhere. My parents told me to avoid going down there alone. Naturally, I did the opposite. One day, I grabbed a flashlight and explored. There were storage rooms with bare concrete walls, a laundry area, and a strange little nook at the far end. The air smelled stale. My flashlight beam illuminated a short sealed door. It looked like it once led to a crawl space or an unfinished room. I couldn't open it because there were no hinges or knob, just a door-like panel. I felt goosebumps prickle on my arms. That moment, I heard what sounded like soft scratching from behind it. It could have been pipes or rodents, but it set my heart hammering. I ran upstairs, nearly colliding with my mother. She saw my face and asked if I was okay. I nodded and brushed it off. Later that evening, I heard my parents discussing the basement in low voices. My mother said she'd heard something down there too. My father said we shouldn't jump to conclusions, but he looked worried. We stayed in that house for 6 months, during which I often felt uneasy. Sometimes I heard faint knocking in the walls at night. My mother said it was old pipes, but I wasn't sure. We moved again soon after. As I got older, I tried to talk to my father about all these moves. I wanted a straight explanation. He told me that we had a family tradition of avoiding houses that gave us bad vibes. It sounded too simple. What kind of tradition was that? He shrugged, as if he didn't know how else to say it. I recall him once mentioning that his grandfather refused to stay in a house if he felt a certain heaviness or stillness in the air. That habit apparently passed down through the generations. My father admitted that maybe it was irrational, but it was how he was raised. In my early 20s, I got a chance to visit one of the older houses we had lived in when I was younger, just out of personal curiosity. It was a compact place with a steep staircase leading to a second floor. The new owners gave me a polite but guarded welcome, letting me see the interior. I noticed the same slight tilt in the hallway floor that made it feel off balance. I felt uneasy stepping on it again, as if my memories of that place carried tension. I asked them if they ever experienced anything strange. They just said it was drafty. I nodded, not wanting to pry. Later, I told my mother about my visit, and she looked upset. She said it wasn't wise to revisit old places. That night I overheard her on the phone with another relative, talking in hushed tones. Words like disturbing old energies floated through the conversation. I felt a chill. I realized my family's caution might run deeper than I imagined. It wasn't just about squeaky floors or weird drafts. It was about a shared belief that certain houses carried something intangible, something we should not stir up. Even now, I live on my own, separate from my parents, but the anxiety sticks. When I apartment hunted, I found myself meticulously checking corners, listening to how the rooms felt. I ended up in a modern building with solid construction, mostly to avoid the sense of creeping unease that old houses bring me. But part of me wonders if I'll always carry that family trait. A heightened awareness of certain quiet spaces, certain stale patches of air. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at walls or ceilings, half expecting a soft knock or a faint scratch. My relatives still meet occasionally for small reunions or holiday dinners. Inevitably, someone brings up the old houses, though never in explicit terms. They'll say things like, "That was the place with the odd corridor," or "We never liked the attic in that one," and leave it at that. Nobody tells a clear story. Nobody says they saw anything. It's all hints and half-statements. The tension in the room tightens each time, and I feel a slight dryness in my mouth. It's hard to explain that kind of unease to friends. They assume my family is just quirky, or that we exaggerate normal house noises. Maybe we do, but the consistent discomfort is too strong for me to ignore. I sometimes wonder if one of my ancestors had a traumatic experience in a house and passed down the fear. Or maybe they believed in certain omens or superstitions that got woven into our family habits. I wish I had a definitive explanation. All I know is that the older generation acts as though they understand something we don't. Some unwritten rule about quiet spaces and the corners of old homes. Whenever we gather, I sense that unspoken bond of caution. We don't need to discuss it openly. A single glance, a single change of topic is enough to remind us of our shared background. My grandmother passed away a few years ago without ever telling me what, exactly, she feared about those houses. My parents remain mostly tight-lipped, though they sometimes slip and mention hearing footsteps behind walls or seeing doors shift slightly at night. The real tension doesn't come from a single dramatic event. It's the slow accumulation of small, unsettling details. I remember all those times I walked through narrow hallways in different houses, hearing floorboards groan in patterns that sounded deliberate, or glimpsing odd shapes in cramped storage spaces. Each memory piles onto the next, forming a vague but persistent unease. Maybe those incidents were all explainable. Drafts, old construction, normal settling. But my family's quiet worry turned them into something else. Now, as an adult, I don't move around as much. I keep my own place clean and well lit. I avoid basements whenever possible. I don't enjoy exploring attics. When I visit my parents, they still have that watchful look if the house they're in has certain features they dislike. An oddly shaped room, a cramped closet, or an unusually silent corridor. And they still talk in low voices about the old family pattern of leaving houses quickly when things didn't feel right. It's as if they believe they're protecting themselves from an unseen threat by staying watchful and ready to move on. I've accepted that this hush around our houses will never fully break. We don't have a definitive story to tell, just a collection of vague incidents and that shared apprehension. Whether it's real or imagined, it's part of our family identity. And each time I find myself alone in a quiet room, I listen for that subtle tension in the air, wondering if I've inherited more of their fears than I care to admit. Gnawing tension. That was my first sensation when I stepped out of my patrol car in that quiet neighborhood on a cold December evening. A local resident had reported a strange figure standing outside a house decorated with Christmas lights, but no one had lived there for months. The property had belonged to an older man who had passed away in the summer, and the place was supposed to be vacant. I arrived at the curb around 8 p.m., switched off the engine, and immediately noticed a row of blinking lights draped across the porch of the empty house. I walked up the sidewalk. The woman who had called stood near her own window, peering out through a thin gap in her curtains. She gave me a quick wave. I nodded, wanting to let her know I was there. The street itself was silent, save for the hum of a distant car passing a few blocks away. Snow crunched under my boots. A few houses had Christmas ornaments on their lawns, plastic reindeer and candy canes, but none looked as pristine or as brightly lit as the property in question. I arrived at the neighboring house's driveway and took a moment to look around. The yard was tidy, the walkway cleared of snow. A single lamp glowed on the front porch. Above, strings of multicolored bulbs blinked in a slow, rhythmic pattern. They created an eerie glow against the snow. I felt a slight chill on the back of my neck. It might have been the cold air, but something about the place felt off. I approached the front door and tried to peer inside through the window beside it. The interior was dark, and I couldn't make out any shape or movement. I knocked on the door, calling out to see if anyone was inside. My voice sounded small in the stillness of the night. I waited, listening carefully for footsteps or any sign that someone was there. Silence. The door was locked, and there was no answer. I circled around the house, stepping carefully to avoid slipping. A narrow path led me to the backyard. I shone my flashlight on the windows. Each one was shut, the curtains drawn. I tried the back door. It was also locked. I didn't see any signs of forced entry. I tapped the window glass to see if that would provoke a reaction. Nothing happened. I heard a muffled sound from the front, like the soft buzz of the Christmas lights changing patterns. My chest felt tight, not from fear, so much as the curiosity that was gnawing at me. Someone had reported a figure on the porch, yet I couldn't find a single indication that anyone had been here at all. The snow near the steps showed no footprints other than my own. The yard had no tracks. I stopped, turned off my flashlight, and listened again. Nothing but my own breathing. I walked back around to the front and noticed the lights flicker in an odd way. They seemed to slow down, as if their blinking pattern had changed from the standard mechanical rhythm. It was subtle, but I stood there staring at them. Usually, Christmas lights keep the same sequence. These felt more deliberate. It reminded me of someone pausing between each flash, but I brushed away that thought and chalked it up to a faulty timer or an old circuit. I glanced at the neighbor's house. She was still at the window, watching me. I gave her a quick wave to signal that everything was okay. The tension in my shoulders lingered, though. I moved to the sidewalk so I could see the entire row of lights. They ran along the edge of the roof and down the porch railing. The timing of the blinking shifted slightly whenever I looked away. At least, that was my impression. I tried not to let my imagination run wild, but I couldn't deny the odd feeling. I radioed in my location and let dispatch know I was investigating a possible trespasser. I kept my voice steady, though I felt a slight adrenaline rush. The dispatcher acknowledged me and advised me to look for forced entry or other signs of tampering. That's exactly what I had been doing, so I repeated that everything looked normal from the outside. I decided to talk to the caller directly. I walked next door, where the woman stood inside her porch. She opened the door when she saw me approaching. I could see the worry in her eyes. She told me she had noticed a silhouette standing right in front of the neighbor's veranda about an hour earlier. She described a tall shape, possibly wearing a coat, just staring at the lights. When she peeked again, it was gone. She called me because the house had been empty for months, and she found it strange that the lights were still functioning and that someone might be lurking around. I thanked her for the information and promised to keep looking around a bit longer. I asked if she had heard any noises. She shook her head, just the typical hum of the lights and a faint electrical buzz they sometimes made. I assured her I would let her know if I found anything suspicious. Walking back to the vacant house, I noticed the lights pulsing in a softer pattern now. It was almost a continuous glow. I stepped onto the porch again. The boards creaked under my boots. I leaned against the railing to get a feel for whether anything was loose or tampered with. Everything was in place, no sign of vandalism or prying. The windows looked intact. I felt the hair on my arms prickle. My stomach tightened. I had the sensation that I was being watched. I turned around slowly, shining my flashlight over the yard, the street, and the windows across the road. I saw nothing unusual, no cars passing by, no pedestrians. A faint breeze rustled the branches of a small tree near the sidewalk. I moved my beam across the porch again, checking the corners and the shadows behind a few outdoor chairs. They were empty, covered in a light dusting of snow. I stepped off the porch and took a few steps toward the street. The lights behind me flashed 3 times and then held a steady glow for several seconds before resuming a regular blink. I whipped around, and for a split second I thought I saw a vague shape reflected in one of the windows on the door. I froze. My pulse kicked up. I steadied my flashlight and aimed it at the window. There was only the reflection of the lights and a bit of my own silhouette. I stepped closer to be sure. The glass was cold and clear. Nobody stood behind me. I knocked on the door one more time, calling out in a firm voice for anyone inside to identify themselves. I waited. The house stayed silent. I heard the woman next door slide her window open and ask if everything was all right. I said I was just double-checking. She confirmed from her vantage point that she saw something shift near the door just now. I didn't contradict her, but I explained it might have been a reflection. She didn't look convinced, and in truth, neither was I. I tried to open one of the windows along the front. It was locked tight. I had no grounds to break in, no sign of criminal activity. My mind told me this was just a faulty lighting system, an empty house with a simple holiday setup that hadn't been taken down yet. Still, The weird blinking pattern got under my skin. I felt a light sweat on my neck despite the cold. I stepped back to the sidewalk and looked up at the second-floor windows. All dark. No curtains parted, no flicker of movement. Then the lights took on a slow fade, cycling between vibrant and dim in a loop. It was the strangest thing. I stood there, transfixed, waiting for something to happen. The cold air stung my cheeks. My breath formed puffs that vanished quickly. After a few minutes, I forced myself to wrap up the call. There was nothing more I could do legally. No trespasser was present, or if there was, they were well hidden and not making any noise. I walked to my patrol car and climbed inside. Once seated, I let out a long exhale. My heart pounded harder than I liked to admit. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I buckled my seatbelt. Through the back window, I saw the lights continue their strange blinking. I began typing up a brief note in my log. Spoke to complainant, checked property, no evidence of forced entry, no visible intruder. That was all the official record could say. But I knew the situation felt different from a standard false alarm. I put the car into gear, ready to pull away. As I rolled forward, I paused to look once more at the house. The lights had stopped blinking altogether. Now they shone in a steady, cool white glow. I squinted, unsure if it was an actual change or my imagination. I turned my head to see if the neighbor had noticed, but she had already shut her window. My chest felt heavy. I let my foot rest on the brake, waiting a few seconds. The lights suddenly resumed their usual blinking, almost like they were responding to me lingering there. I forced myself to drive off. As I turned the corner, my palms felt sweaty against the steering wheel. My mind went over every detail. No footprints in the snow, no forced entry, no open doors or windows, no sign of an actual trespasser. The only facts were the lights and that fleeting figure the neighbor swore she saw. I couldn't solve a problem I couldn't find. The rest of my shift was ordinary. I responded to a noise complaint, did a routine patrol of another residential area, and handled some paperwork at the station. Yet the memory of those flickering lights hovered in my mind. I kept thinking about that brief moment when I thought I saw a reflection of someone behind me, and how the neighbor confirmed she saw something too, only for it to vanish. I tried to justify it logically. Maybe a trick of the light, or the neighbor's anxious imagination. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was deliberately toying with us. When I got home later that night, I replayed the scene in my head. I pictured the crisp lines of the porch, the clean snow, and those lights blinking in patterns that didn't match any store-bought timer I'd ever seen. I recalled the house's locked doors and silent windows. No matter how many times I turned it over in my thoughts, I couldn't make it all fit. It was an empty home, but it felt occupied in a way that made my skin crawl. Later, whenever I passed that street on routine patrols, I found reasons to slow down near the same house. The lights stayed up for the rest of December. They glowed every evening, sometimes in a regular pattern, sometimes flickering in that odd, hesitating way. I never saw anyone near the porch again, nor did the neighbor call me back. Eventually, the new year arrived, and the lights were taken down by someone, maybe relatives of the deceased owner. I never found out who removed them. Even so, the memory lingered. I always wonder if there really was someone standing there, transfixed by those Christmas lights in front of a house nobody lived in. Maybe it was just a vagrant who wandered off. Or maybe I encountered something I couldn't fully explain with a police report. Whatever it was, I never caught a glimpse of it again, and I haven't forgotten the unsettled feeling of those lights flashing in the cold December air, as if they were watching me just as carefully as I was watching them. relentless cold. That was my first impression when I pulled onto the deserted stretch of highway on a December night. The radio dispatch had directed me miles away from any town toward a single bus stop that someone claimed was occupied by a lone person who looked lost. By the time I arrived, everything around me felt motionless. The fields were bare, covered in a thin layer of snow that reflected the moonlight. My patrol car's headlights revealed a small wooden shelter marked by a faded bus schedule. No streetlights, no buildings, no visible traffic. I stepped out of my car and felt the sting of the freezing air on my face. The nearest sign of life was probably miles down the road. There were no lights except for my headlights and the pale moon overhead. My breath came in visible bursts. With each step, my boots crunched on the packed snow. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but I didn't see any figure waiting for a bus. The shelter itself was empty. Wooden bench, plexiglass walls with a few cracks, and a small poster advertising seasonal routes from what looked like years ago. I called out, identifying myself as law enforcement. Silence. My ears picked up only a faint whistle of wind crossing the open plain. The dispatcher had said a driver reported seeing someone there. The driver was insistent they spotted a person sitting on the bench, but as I looked around, there was no one. The place felt abandoned. I moved closer to the shelter, shining my light on the bench. The wood was slightly damp, but I saw no belongings, no footprints on the platform itself. Then I noticed a set of faint footprints in the snow leading toward the bench from a nearby ditch. I crouched down to examine the tracks. They seemed fairly fresh. The edges were not yet blown away or melted, suggesting they'd been made not long before I arrived. I followed them with my flashlight, stepping carefully. They led to the front of the bench and then abruptly stopped. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. There were no returning footprints in the opposite direction, no sign of a struggle, no prints leading off the side. I stood there confused, scanning the ground for any clues. The snow around that area was mostly undisturbed. I felt a mild unease in my stomach. This wasn't normal. Footprints don't just end without explanation. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. The cold wind intensified, as if the temperature dropped by another few degrees. I called out again, raising my voice. "Hello? Does anyone need help?" My words echoed. No response. I turned my attention back to the shelter. A flimsy piece of paper was tacked to the inside wall. It displayed a holiday bus schedule from years ago. It advertised a special Christmas route, complete with festive decorations and hot cocoa offered on board. It was obviously out of date, but no one had bothered to remove it. The edges were yellowed. I touched it, and the paper crinkled under my fingertips. Right then, I heard a faint sound off to my right, like fabric brushing against wood. I snapped my flashlight in that direction. Nothing. My pulse quickened. I didn't see any movement, no shadows or animals scurrying around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been there a moment before. The area was wide open. There were no trees, no large rocks, nowhere someone could hide without leaving footprints. The edges of the highway stretched into darkness. My mind ran through the possibilities. Could it have been the wind moving something loose? Or was there someone out there watching me from a distance? The emptiness weighed on me. I tried to use my radio to check in, but I got a burst of static. That could happen in remote areas, so I fiddled with the dial, waiting for a clear signal. Finally, I managed to confirm my location, but the transmission was shaky. The dispatcher asked if I found anyone. I told them I hadn't. They told me to file a simple check if I saw no sign of wrongdoing. I said I'd do a quick sweep. I walked around the entire shelter, The wooden posts holding up the roof were weathered. One of them had a slight crack. The bench was bolted down, and the seat was cold to the touch. A tiny patch of snow had accumulated in one corner, suggesting the wind occasionally blew sideways through the gap in the plastic panel. I felt the tension in my jaw increase. Something felt off. There was an energy about the place that I couldn't describe in rational terms. I tried to remain professional. My job was to confirm there was no immediate danger or person in need. I decided to follow the footprints more thoroughly. I traced them back from the bench to where they began, near the ditch by the side of the road. The ditch had a thin layer of ice, some dead grass poking through. I aimed my flashlight downward, but the surface of the ice was unbroken. If someone had been standing here, they should have left a clearer trail if they moved away. Instead, I just saw the footprints walking in a straight line to the bus stop and then stopping. The emptiness around me started to feel oppressive. My breathing grew sharper, and I felt my heart beat faster. I tried calling out once more, "If you can hear me, please come out. I just want to help." Nothing, only the wind. The sky above was clear, with stars scattered overhead. I tried to reassure myself that the driver might have been mistaken, or they saw a person who left quickly. But the footprints told a different story. After a few minutes of not finding anything new, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The wind became calm. My own breathing sounded louder. I found myself listening for any sign of life, even the rustle of a small animal. Everything was still. My gut told me to leave, but I also felt a duty to make sure no one was out there freezing. I walked a perimeter around the shelter, shining my flashlight on the snow. No more footprints, just a wide expanse of white, with the highway running east and west as far as I could see. I returned to the shelter's interior, just to be certain I hadn't missed anything on the bench or under it. That's when I heard the static in my radio burst to life. It surprised me. My hand twitched. I lifted it closer to my ear. A slight crackle was all I got. I tried speaking to the dispatcher. The static persisted. Then it cut out. That was unusual, especially since my signal had come through a moment ago. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I exhaled and decided it was time to wrap up. If there was no sign of distress, I had no reason to linger. I took a final glance at the footprints. They still ended in that unexplainable way. My mind conjured scenarios. Maybe someone had jumped onto a passing truck, or maybe they'd stepped backward in their own footprints. But that would be obvious in the snow. None of it made sense. I stood in front of the bench, shining my flashlight on the old holiday schedule. The year printed there was at least 5 years past. I didn't recognize the local sponsor. It featured pictures of families smiling, holding presents. I tried peeling it off the wall. It resisted at first, then tore slightly around the corners. At that exact moment, I heard that same soft sound of fabric against wood, this time seeming to come from behind me, near the road. My muscles tensed. I spun around, heart pounding. The highway was empty. The ditch was empty. I stepped out from under the roof of the bus shelter, feeling the cold air on my face again. The moonlight cast sharp shadows. The footprints, the ditch, the wide road. No movement. Yet the sound had felt so close, like someone brushing by. I swallowed the lump in my throat and clicked off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight. Maybe I'd see something better that way. My breath clouded in front of me, and my ears strained to pick up any hint of noise. Nothing moved. My radio remained silent. I lingered a minute more, scanning every corner of the scene. Finally, I told myself there was nothing else to do. I walked back to my car, each step feeling heavy. My boots left fresh imprints in the snow. I climbed inside, shut the door, and let out a long breath. I turned on the engine, feeling the warm air trickle out of the vents. The heater's hum broke the silence. Before driving away, I checked my rearview mirror. The bus shelter stood there, lonely and still. The bench, the battered sign, and the footprints that led nowhere. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to double-check, but I knew it would yield the same result. I'd seen everything there was to see. I typed a quick note into the log on my onboard computer. Searched area, no individual found. Possible mistaken sighting. Found footprints that end abruptly. No further action required. It felt incomplete, but I had no better explanation. I shifted into drive and pulled back onto the highway. The wheels crunched on the icy shoulder before gripping the main lane. As I left, I glanced in the rearview mirror again. For a split second, I thought I saw a faint silhouette in the glow of my taillights, right at the corner of the shelter's bench. My heart jolted. I slowed down, trying to confirm what I saw. The red glow faded into the distance, and when I refocused, there was nothing there. Just the shape of the bus shelter. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I fought the urge to stop again. I told myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination playing games after so many minutes in the dark. I pressed the gas pedal, accelerating away from the scene. The road was long, and I had other calls waiting, but my thoughts lingered on that bus stop. It haunted me how those footprints ended right in front of the bench, with nowhere else to go, and that small sound of fabric against wood that kept coming from empty space. At the end of my shift, I filed the report, as usual. No suspect, no tangible threat, just a deserted bus shelter with a puzzling set of tracks. But the memory stuck with me. Whenever I passed that stretch of highway afterward, I felt a pull to look toward that shelter, half expecting to see someone sitting there again. I never found out who made those footprints or why they disappeared, and I never found an explanation for the subtle noises I heard that night. Still, even now, I recall the sharp, biting cold on my cheeks and the uneasy feeling that someone was just out of sight, watching me. I remember the old holiday bus schedule, yellowed and curled at the edges, hinting at a time long gone. The caller swore she saw a solitary figure in that spot. I couldn't prove her wrong, but I also couldn't prove her right. All I know is that for one strange December night, that bus stop felt like it contained more than just an empty bench in the middle of nowhere. And I left it with an unsettling realization that some encounters can't be fully explained or dismissed, no matter how thorough you try to be. Dread. That was the feeling I got the moment I stepped out of my patrol car near the entrance of the park trail. It was a few days before Christmas, and the city was calm. Most people stayed home because the temperatures had dropped below freezing. My assignment was simple: investigate reports of late-night whispers echoing along a normally quiet path. I thought it might be pranksters or a few people seeking a hidden spot to drink. But something about the voice on the other end of the dispatch call unsettled me. They sounded genuinely afraid. I walked into the park, noticing the faint orange glow of distant streetlights. The trail itself was shrouded in darkness, except for a few weak lamps spaced too far apart to provide much visibility. The snow crunched under my boots, and I could see my breath. My flashlight beam cut across the ground, showing scattered footprints leading in multiple directions. Most were old and partially melted or iced over. I radioed my position. Dispatch told me to proceed with caution and check in if I needed backup. I acknowledged and ventured deeper, following the main trail. The cold wind bit at my ears. My gloved hand gripped my flashlight more tightly than usual. Even with multiple layers of clothing, the chill in the air felt sharper than normal. I scanned the area to my left and right, searching for any figure or movement. Nothing. Just bare trees, stripped of leaves, their branches bending slightly under thin layers of snow. I heard a slight rustle, but I realized it was just wind brushing through a patch of dead foliage near the path. I relaxed my shoulders and kept walking. A few yards later, I thought I heard something that sounded like a low murmur. I snapped my flashlight toward the noise. The beam caught only empty benches and a trash bin. I stared for a moment, listening. The sound didn't repeat. Possibly my imagination, I thought. The wind in these branches could play tricks on a person's ears. I moved forward, one slow step at a time, scanning the trail ahead. I noticed a small incline leading to a fenced overlook area. The lamppost there flickered once, then went dark. That put me on edge. I picked up my pace, wanting a better look. When I reached the top of the incline, I paused. The lamppost remained off, leaving only my flashlight to provide illumination. As I swung the beam across the fence line, something red caught my eye. A single scarf dangled from a low branch of an overgrown shrub next to the fence. It was a bright red scarf, the type someone might wear for fashion more than warmth. It looked out of place. It didn't appear frozen or weather-beaten, which made me suspect it had been left recently. My pulse quickened. I glanced around to see if anyone was near. Nothing. The area was silent except for faint wind. I approached the scarf and reached out to touch it. The fabric felt dry, not stiff from ice, so I guessed it hadn't been there long. I called out, "Hello? Did someone lose a scarf?" My voice echoed across the empty park. No answer. A distant rustling came from somewhere in the trees, but it faded quickly. I turned my flashlight in that direction, saw only branches and darkness. That's when I heard a soft sound behind me. I spun around, my heartbeat spiking. It sounded like a quiet exhale of laughter or a breathy whisper. My flashlight revealed empty trail. I stood there for a few seconds, my stomach tight, trying to figure out if I was imagining things. The echo of that faint noise lingered in my mind. I didn't like how it made my skin crawl. I tried to calm myself, reminding my brain there could be 100 reasons for odd noises in a public park at night. Stray animals, shifts in the wind, or an overactive mind. Yet this didn't feel ordinary. I gripped the scarf with my gloved hand. Part of me wanted to bag it as evidence in case something was going on. But there was no sign of a crime, and protocol didn't call for me to confiscate random clothing items left in a public space. I decided to hang it back on the branch for now and keep moving. I continued along the fence line, shining my flashlight over the ground for footprints. I spotted faint indentations in the snow. They looked relatively fresh, leading away from the main path into a more secluded area where the city hadn't placed any lamps. I paused. Going off the lit path in these conditions didn't appeal to me, but I felt a responsibility to check. I followed the footprints slowly, my flashlight sweeping left to right. I inhaled through my nose, trying to keep my breath steady. The prints led me down a narrow, branching trail that curved behind a line of trees. The wind was calmer here, so I could hear every step I took. There were no overhead lamps now. Everything came down to my flashlight beam. After a short distance, the footprints disappeared. The snow looked undisturbed ahead. I searched around the edges for any sign that someone stepped aside or doubled back. I found nothing. It was like the person had simply vanished. My pulse throbbed in my throat. I tried calling out again, "Is anyone here?" The silence pressed in on me. I stood for a few moments, turning in a slow circle. My flashlight revealed tree trunks, patches of snow, and the flicker of my own breath. No movement, no figure. The tension in my body ramped up. I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck again, like I was being watched. I listened hard, but there was no sound beyond the dull creak of branches overhead. Eventually, I decided to head back toward the main path. My job wasn't to explore every nook of the park alone, especially with no sign of immediate trouble. I retraced my steps carefully, flashlight sweeping the ground. I soon reached the spot where the footprints had started. At least I could find my way back. I headed in the direction of the red scarf. As I neared the fence, my flashlight caught a glimpse of the shrub where I'd left the scarf. The branch was empty. The scarf was gone. I froze in place, my heart hammering. I knew exactly where I had hung it. I felt the branch with my gloved hand, half expecting to see the scarf on the ground. It wasn't there. I looked around, shining my light across the fence, the snow, the area below the shrub. Nothing. No scraps of red fabric, no new footprints that would indicate someone grabbed it. Adrenaline surged through me. I half yelled, "Who's there?" My voice echoed off the trees. The response I got was just a sudden gust of wind that rattled some branches. I tried to calm my breathing but found it difficult. I felt my throat tighten and my palms grow damp under my gloves. I took a few steps back, glancing around to see if anyone hid among the trees. The only footprints in the snow were mine. I reported my status to dispatch, explaining that I found nothing substantial, but something felt off. I asked if there had been more calls about the park. They said no. I tried to regain composure. The last thing I wanted was for them to think I was rattled by a missing piece of fabric. I told them I'd finish checking the area and then return to my vehicle. I walked back to the main trail, sweeping it thoroughly. I checked behind the benches, under them, around the trash bins. I looked for any sign of the scarf lying in the snow. It was nowhere to be seen. Occasionally, the wind carried a faint noise, but I couldn't be sure if it was the same whisper-like sound I heard before. My pulse stayed elevated. My mouth felt dry. I realized I'd been gripping my flashlight so hard my hand was cramping. I did a final pass along the center path, which led to the entrance of the park. The snow in some spots looked undisturbed, and in others, old footprints indicated typical daytime walkers or joggers. But I saw no fresh prints. I paused once more at a small wooden sign that displayed park rules. The sign had some old flyers pinned to it, half torn off. I read them out of habit. Nothing relevant. I exhaled, feeling a bit foolish for being so on edge about a missing scarf. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving with no explanation. I reached the entrance and spotted my patrol car under the dim streetlight. The car looked welcoming. I got in quickly, locking the doors more out of habit than fear. I let out a long breath as I turned on the engine and waited for the heater to kick in. My cheeks felt cold, and I rubbed them, trying to ease the tension in my face. I knew I had done my job, but the sense of unease lingered. I started filing a brief report on my onboard computer, stating, "Inspected park trail, no sign of disturbance. Found a scarf, now missing. Heard faint noises, possibly wind. No further evidence, no suspect." Before I shifted into drive, I glanced at the tree line near the entrance. The wind moved the branches, and small flakes of snow fell under a lamp. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of color, like something red, but when I focused, it was just the reflection of the lamp on patches of ice. My heart pounded again. I wiped my forehead, even though it was cold. Then I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the dark trail behind me. On the ride back, I couldn't stop thinking about that scarf. It wasn't valuable or unusual, but it had vanished without explanation. I kept replaying the moment I heard that quiet laugh or whisper behind me, the look of the footprints that led nowhere, the sense of being watched, and the final realization that I had no solid clues. I told myself it might have been someone messing around, grabbing the scarf after I left. But the footprints would have been visible. I saw none. That night, I finished my shift with a nagging feeling in my gut. I drove home, trying to brush off the tension. I told myself it was just a random oddity, and that the mind can amplify small details in the dark. Yet I couldn't entirely convince myself. The memory of seeing that bright red cloth swinging gently on the branch, then discovering it gone, wouldn't leave my thoughts. It still felt like I'd brushed up against something I couldn't explain. The next time I patrolled that area, I made sure to pass by the same trail. I found nothing unusual. The path looked normal. No reports of missing items or strange whispers. No fresh footprints that stopped in the middle of nowhere. I told myself it was over. But I still remember the jolt of adrenaline, the vanished scarf, and that faint laugh that made my skin crawl in a way no routine patrol ever had. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest calls can leave you with the strongest sense of unease and a realization that not everything will fit neatly into a report. Uneasy dread. That was my first reaction when I got the late-night call about gentle tapping on a window in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The resident insisted someone was knocking each night, yet they never spotted a culprit. I arrived around 1 in the morning, parked my patrol car under a street lamp, and took a moment to scan the surroundings. The street was calm. A row of single-family houses stretched on both sides, each decorated with colored lights and holiday wreaths. Snow blanketed the lawns and driveways, reflecting the faint glow of porch lamps. I stepped out of my vehicle and felt the biting cold on my cheeks. My boots crunched on the packed snow as I approached the reported house. It looked like a typical suburban home, 2 stories, shutters on the windows, a wreath on the front door, and a string of blinking lights along the roofline. The occupant, a middle-aged man wearing a thick robe, greeted me at the door. He seemed relieved to see me, though worry lines creased his forehead. He invited me inside, and I wiped my boots on the mat, noticing that the air smelled faintly of pine from a Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. He told me the tapping always happened between midnight and 2 in the morning. He had gone outside earlier in the night to check, but found no footprints around the windows. It had happened again that night, which prompted him to call. He led me to the window in question, a large window facing the front yard. From there, I could see my patrol car and the faint glow of the street lamp. I looked carefully at the window frame, then the sill outside. Everything was clean, no sign of scratches or forced entry. The snow beneath the window was undisturbed. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the chill from outside. I tapped the window with my knuckles to replicate the sound. It produced a soft, hollow knock that could be interpreted as a gentle tapping if someone stood outside. The man nodded, saying that was exactly the noise he'd been hearing for days. I asked him if he had any idea who might be doing this, maybe teenagers pulling pranks. He shook his head, saying the neighborhood was quiet, mostly older couples or families who kept to themselves. No one had shown any strange behavior, and none of his neighbors had reported the same issue, as far as he knew. I told him I'd step outside to look around again, just to be sure. He walked with me to the front door, and I saw his hand tremble slightly as he turned the knob. The worry in his eyes was obvious. He seemed tired, like he hadn't slept well for days. Outside, I shined my flashlight on the snow. It was late, and not a single car passed on the road. The holiday lights on the houses made the street look festive, but there was a stillness to the air that felt tense. I carefully inspected the ground under the window, crouching low to see if there might be any shallow impressions or disturbances. I found nothing but pristine snow. No footprints, no sign of something dragged, no scattered debris. I moved around to the side of the house, checking beneath the other windows. The occupant followed me at a short distance. He stayed silent, occasionally glancing toward his neighbor's property. I noticed the windows there were similarly decorated with lights, but nothing looked out of place. My flashlight revealed more undisturbed snow. After a few minutes of finding no clues, I circled back to the front yard. I decided to knock on a few windows from outside to see if the occupant inside could hear the difference. I tapped lightly on the glass while he stood inside. He later told me it sounded more or less identical to what he'd been hearing each night. I felt a slight unease in my chest. If the tapping matched my demonstration, and I was leaving no footprints, it suggested that someone might have been extremely careful, or that the snow somehow refroze to mask footprints. But the temperature had remained below freezing for a while, making that scenario less likely. I thought about an animal, but the resident insisted the sound was deliberate, like knuckles on glass. I told him that I couldn't find any direct evidence of trespassing or malicious behavior. I promised to patrol the area a few extra times that night. He thanked me, though he still looked uneasy. I asked him to call again if it happened while I was nearby. Then I stepped back into my car, turned the heater on, and began to write my notes on the onboard computer. No visible footprints, no forced entry. Occupant reports repeated tapping on window, nighttime hours. That was the gist of my preliminary report. I sighed. Calls like these were not uncommon around the holidays, but this one felt different, if only because of the occupant's genuine anxiety and the total absence of any trace outside. I planned to do a slow drive around the block. The streetlights gave off a faint orange glow, illuminating patches of snow on each driveway. A few homes had gone all out with decorations, while others had simpler setups. All looked peaceful. I saw no parked cars that didn't belong. I completed the circuit and parked a short distance away, watching the house from my rearview mirror. After about 20 minutes, my radio crackled. It was dispatch checking if everything was all right. I confirmed that I was still on the scene, keeping watch. Suddenly, I heard a muffled thump that seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I looked around the interior of the car, but everything was in place. The street was still. I stepped out and listened. The cold air hit me. My breath formed small clouds that vanished quickly. The only sound was a distant hum from a neighbor's heat pump. I didn't see any movement near the occupant's house or anywhere else. The lamp overhead hummed faintly. I stood there for a minute, scanning the yards and porches. Nothing stirred. I got back in my car and was about to resume my patrol when the occupant called again. He said the tapping had come back, this time on a different window. My heart rate accelerated as I told him to remain calm and that I would be right there. I pulled up in front of his driveway. He opened the door, visibly shaken, and pointed to a side window by the dining area. He said he heard 2 solid taps that made him jump. I went straight to the window, shining my flashlight outside. The ground was flawless, no footprints. I pressed my ear to the glass. Silence. The occupant stood a few feet away, arms crossed. I could see sweat on his forehead despite the cold. He apologized for calling me again, but said he was sure about what he heard. I told him not to apologize, that I'd rather investigate a false alarm than miss something important. We stayed in the dining area for a couple of minutes. The only sounds were the ticking of a nearby clock and the low hum of the heating system. I considered the possibility of tree branches scraping the siding or some mechanical issue with the house. But there were no branches close to the window, and the occupant insisted the tapping was deliberate. I tested the wall for any loose siding or anything that might shift in the wind. Everything felt solid. I walked around the house one more time. This time, I noticed a slight pattern in the snow near the dining window. Some of the top layer looked like it had been brushed aside, but it wasn't a footprint. It was more like someone had lightly kicked it, leaving a scuff. I knelt down and inspected the area, hoping to find some clue. I saw no distinct shape or shoe size. If someone had been standing there, they must have been incredibly careful, or they had a tool to remove tracks. But it was faint enough that I couldn't confirm anything. I was on edge. My breathing grew heavy as I realized how strange this situation was. I wasn't dealing with a simple case of wind-blown debris. The occupant was genuine in his fear. The tapping had occurred multiple times with no visible sign of an intruder. The brushed snow could have been nothing, or it could have been proof that someone was playing an unnerving game. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My mind raced with scenarios, but I had nothing concrete to act on. With no suspect and no solid evidence, I had reached the limit of what I could do by normal procedure. I told the occupant to keep his curtains closed, leave an outside light on, and call if he heard anything again. I promised to drive by every so often for the rest of the night. He expressed gratitude but looked worried as he escorted me back to the door. Before stepping out, I glanced toward the window once more, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. But there was nothing, just my reflection in the faint glare of the interior light. I shook off the unease, nodded to the man, and walked back into the frigid air. My boots made the familiar crunch in the snow. I felt the tension in my shoulders, a tension that didn't go away even after I got in my patrol car and turned on the heat. I filed my second brief update. Another report of tapping, no signs of forced entry, possible slight disturbance in the snow, but inconclusive. Will maintain extra patrol. That was all I could do officially. I pulled away from the house and continued my rounds in that neighborhood. Every so often I circled back, shining my spotlight on his windows from a distance, waiting to catch a glimpse of something. The windows remained dark, no motion in the yard. Around 4 a.m., I called it a night. I had to move on. No further calls came in. Still, the situation left a strange weight in my chest, the kind of feeling you get when you know there's more going on than you can prove. In the days that followed, I checked the logs. No new reports came from that address. The occupant eventually stopped calling. Maybe the tapping stopped, or maybe he just learned to live with it. I never got a clear answer. But I remember that cold night, the silent street, and the faint scuff in the snow by the dining window. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat when I imagined catching someone outside with no footprints left behind. It was just a routine call on paper, something that could be written off as a trick of the wind or a neighbor's prank. Yet it felt more unsettling than many louder, more obvious incidents I'd responded to. I still think about it whenever I pass that suburban block. The memory of gentle tapping in the still night air remains etched in my mind, and I doubt I'll ever forget the look on that resident's face when he heard it yet again, knowing that whatever was out there, I couldn't pin it down or make it stop. Vigilant tension. That was my first reaction as I drove down the gravel road toward a small rural property on a cold December afternoon. Dispatch had told me the landowner kept seeing a figure wandering among the dry fields. but whenever he got close, it turned out to be a scarecrow wearing a tattered Santa hat. The call seemed strange, but I'd learned never to dismiss a concern without checking. When I parked my patrol car by the main gate, I noticed the landowner standing on his porch. He was an older man, bundled up in a heavy coat and knitted cap, looking troubled. The house behind him was modest, with peeling paint and a single strand of Christmas lights around the doorframe. He waved, and I stepped out, feeling the crunch of frozen earth under my boots. The air smelled of dry hay and distant wood smoke. He explained that over the past week he had glimpsed a tall silhouette moving in the field. Each time he grabbed a flashlight and rushed over, only to find the same scarecrow staring back at him. The scarecrow had a cheap Santa hat perched on its head, apparently added as a sort of holiday joke. The man insisted he had already been out there earlier that day, and the scarecrow was in a different spot from where it was originally placed. He seemed spooked, which wasn't surprising. Isolated properties at dusk can feel unsettling, especially in winter. I told him I'd take a look. I walked with him across the yard, stepping carefully over patches of ice. He led me through a narrow gate into a wide field of withered corn stalks. There wasn't much left of the crop, mostly stumps and dry leaves poking out of frozen ground. A bone-chilling breeze cut through my uniform. We trudged forward until we reached the middle of the field, where the scarecrow stood. It wore a faded flannel shirt, ragged jeans stuffed with straw, and a crooked Santa hat that looked older than I expected. I inspected the scarecrow, shining my flashlight across its surface. Its face was drawn on a burlap sack, sporting a rough grin and two large black circles for eyes. The Santa hat was torn around the edges, but that didn't seem unusual. The wooden post holding it up was driven firmly into the ground. I gave it a light push. It was solid. No immediate sign that someone had yanked it out and moved it recently. But I couldn't dismiss the landowner's claims without more thought. Sometimes footprints remain in the soil, but in winter the ground was frozen. It would be easy for someone to shift the scarecrow without leaving a clear trace. I asked if he had noticed anything else, footprints, tire tracks, or any sign of trespassing. He shook his head. The property wasn't large, but it was remote enough that a wandering stranger might hide if they were determined. He pointed to the far side of the field, explaining that he'd once spotted the figure there, near a fence line. When he approached, it turned out to be the same scarecrow, wearing the same hat. He was certain it hadn't been in that spot earlier that day. I studied the area, but it was too dark to see much detail. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows. I decided to walk the perimeter of the field, searching for any fresh disturbance. The landowner followed me at a short distance, shining his own flashlight. The corn stalks rustled in the wind, creating a faint, rattling noise. Occasionally, I'd think I saw a shape at the edge of my vision, but each time I pointed my beam, I found nothing but dried plants. The temperature seemed to drop, making my cheeks burn from the cold. The silence out there was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of our steps and the low whistle of the breeze. We circled back to the scarecrow. I placed my hand on the wooden post again, verifying it hadn't shifted. The Santa hat flapped a little as the wind caught it. I asked the landowner if he'd mind if I took a closer look at the hat itself. He agreed, so I tugged on it carefully. The hat was attached by a bit of fishing line threaded through the burlap. The line was knotted, but not expertly. A person could remove it easily if they wanted. I replaced the hat, making sure not to damage anything. The landowner watched me closely, his breath forming small clouds in the twilight. He admitted he didn't sleep well lately, especially after seeing that silhouette. He said he'd sometimes hear soft shuffling sounds outside, as though someone was pacing by the barn. But each time he checked, Only the scarecrow stood out there, silent and grinning. I advised him to keep a closer watch, maybe install a motion light or a simple camera. He nodded, though he looked uncertain. He added that last night the scarecrow's head was turned in a different direction, facing the house instead of the road. He insisted he hadn't touched it himself. I made mental notes, trying to figure out if this was a prank or something else. A neighbor might be messing with him, or maybe a passing teenager. Rural pranks aren't uncommon, though this felt more personal. The landowner repeated that the scarecrow changed position twice in 1 week, not counting the time he found it turned to face him. I checked the base of the post more thoroughly, scanning it with my flashlight for any fresh cracks or splinters. Nothing stood out. Before leaving the field, I took a final look at the scarecrow from a few yards away. With the dim sky behind it, the figure looked strangely upright, as if it might suddenly step forward. My heartbeat picked up for a moment. I reminded myself it was just cloth and straw. Still, the hush of the field played tricks on my nerves. I told the landowner I'd file a brief report and drive by periodically to keep an eye on things. He seemed relieved, though not fully reassured. We returned to his porch, where a single lantern glowed. He thanked me, and I gave him a card with a non-emergency number, suggesting he call again if anything changed. Then I walked back to my patrol car, the gravel crunching underfoot. The sky was nearly dark. I sat in the driver's seat, turned on the engine, and typed my notes into the onboard computer. Scarecrow reported moving positions. Landowner witnessed silhouette. No signs of forced entry or footprints. Will provide additional patrol. I drove away, headlights sweeping across the fence posts. Even after I left the property behind, I felt a nagging tension. Something about the scarecrow's blank stare and that old Santa hat lingered in my mind. I reached the main road, let out a slow breath, and told myself it was probably just a prank. But part of me wasn't satisfied with that answer. Rural nights can be quiet, but they can also hide strange activities. I reminded myself that there was no evidence of a crime. Still, I planned to return later in my shift to see if anything looked different. Around midnight, I drove back, headlights off as I approached the final stretch of the gravel road. The moon was out, giving me enough light to see the outlines of the fields. I parked in the same spot by the gate, deciding to take a quick look from a distance. The landowner's house was dark, except for a small light in the living room window. I stepped out, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlit field. I scanned the rows of corn stalks with binoculars. The scarecrow was still in place, that Santa hat making it visible against the dull background. It hadn't moved, at least not that I could tell. I stood there for a few minutes, listening for any rustling or voices. The cold gnawed at my ears and nose. A gentle breeze swept across the field, causing the corn stalks to whisper. I felt uneasy, as if the land itself held its breath. Eventually, I decided that was enough. I wasn't going to trespass uninvited, and I saw no sign of suspicious activity. I got back into my car, turned on the engine, and left. In the following days, I spoke with the landowner again. He said the scarecrow still seemed to shift occasionally, but not as dramatically. He installed a cheap motion detector near the barn, though it hadn't been triggered by anything other than the occasional wild animal. He never found footprints or any sign of a visitor. Meanwhile, the Santa hat remained on the scarecrow, flapping in the wind. Eventually, the man said he learned to ignore it, but he still felt uneasy each time he walked past. He told me he avoided going into the field after sunset, just in case. I never confirmed who, if anyone, was behind the strange movements. No one else in the area reported anything similar, and the property line didn't border any major roads or popular paths. The landowner suspected a neighbor with a grudge or a bored local kid, but he had no proof. All I could do was log the incident and promise extra patrols. The official report simply stated, potential trespass, no concrete evidence, possible prank. It felt like a loose end. Still, I recall every moment vividly. The hush of the frozen field, the distant shape of that scarecrow, and the odd story of it moving on its own. Something about its grin under that ragged Santa hat gave me chills. I've handled plenty of bizarre calls, but this one stuck in my mind for the simple fact that no one could explain it. The landowner saw something, or thought he saw something, and the scarecrow always returned to its silent vigil. Even now, when I think about that field, I picture the scarecrow in the moonlight, leaning forward slightly, hat askew, as if it's paying attention. I remind myself it's just burlap and straw on a wooden post. But I can't shake the feeling that the landowner felt truly afraid, and I never gave him a solid answer. That December ended quietly, and life moved on. Yet the memory of that scarecrow, watching from the withered rose, remains one of those cases I can't fully explain or dismiss. Dim hush. That was my first thought when I parked my patrol car by the old pier on a cold December night. The water lay still, with only faint ripples reflecting the weak glow of a few scattered lights. Local residents had reported hearing a distant singing, like a small choir, even though there were no scheduled events in the area. The calls weren't urgent, but the worry in their voices made me take it seriously enough to come by and check. I stepped onto the wooden boards of the pier, feeling them bend slightly under my boots. The wind was light, yet the air stung my cheeks. A worn sign warned people to be cautious of slippery surfaces. The entire place smelled of damp wood and a hint of fish, a common odor for this part of the river. My breath formed small clouds that hung in the air before drifting away. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The pier stretched out before me, with moored boats on either side. Most were covered with tarps or plastic sheets for the winter. The occasional squeak of a rope rubbing against a metal cleat echoed softly. I listened carefully, trying to catch the rumored singing. At first, I heard nothing except the steady lap of water against the wooden posts. I turned on my flashlight, casting its beam along the edges of the dock. Old crates and fishing nets were stacked in corners. A few plastic barrels sat near the far end, possibly used for storing gear. I noticed a single string of Christmas lights hanging from one of the boat masts, flickering erratically. The reflection danced on the dark water. I found it odd that someone left those lights on when nobody was around. I moved forward in short steps, pausing every few yards to listen. My radio was set to a low volume so as not to mask any faint noises. It only emitted a quiet static. The wind picked up a little, causing the rope lines to rattle. A chill ran through me, but I chalked it up to the cold. I sniffed the air, taking in the scent of wet rope and stale fish. Halfway down the pier, I heard a faint murmur that might have been voices or just the wind. I shut my flashlight off, hoping to sharpen my hearing. The darkness swallowed me, except for a faint glow from a distant street lamp on shore. I strained to catch any melody, but the sound faded. My pulse quickened anyway. Something felt odd, an undercurrent of tension in the air. I turned the flashlight back on and walked to the edge of the dock where the water was deeper. A few old fishing boats rocked gently. One had a broken railing, another had peeling paint. I shined the beam over their decks, looking for any sign of people. They were empty. Nets and ropes lay in disarray, but that looked normal for off-season vessels. No movement, no figures hiding behind crates. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like a distant hum, almost like a gentle chorus. It was so faint I questioned whether I imagined it. My skin prickled. I stepped onto one of the boat ramps and crouched, trying to pin down the direction of the noise. The hum drifted away like a cloud of warm breath, dissolving into the quiet air. My thoughts raced. There had been calls from more than one resident, so I believed they weren't all imagining things. Yet I found no speakers, no group, nothing that could produce that kind of soft singing. I recalled one of the callers saying the singing seemed to come from everywhere at once, yet nowhere in particular. That matched my current struggle. The wind can do odd tricks with sound, especially over water, but I had never come across anything quite like this. I switched on my radio and informed dispatch that I was investigating a possible unidentified noise, no sign of trespassers so far. They acknowledged me, advising caution in the dark conditions. I got off the ramp and walked along the main dock, methodically scanning each section. I looked behind a few crates, lifted a corner of a tarp, and peered under some folded netting. No evidence of people messing around or setting up audio equipment. My heartbeat was steady, but my shoulders felt tight. A sense of being watched crept over me, though I saw nobody. Near the end of the pier, I found a small corner where broken boards had been replaced with makeshift planks. An old wire fence separated this section from a rocky embankment. A single Christmas ornament, a tiny plastic star, hung from the fence. It spun slowly, reflecting the faint glow of my flashlight. I touched it, and it felt cold and damp. It didn't look like it belonged there. Maybe a leftover from a holiday event. As I turned back toward the water, I heard a soft, prolonged note. My heartbeat jumped. It almost sounded like a choir holding a simple melody, just one note stretching out. I swung my flashlight across the surface of the river, but all I saw was black water. I tried to see if there was any boat out there or a group on the opposite bank. Nothing. The note faded, replaced by the soft slosh of water against the dock. I decided to investigate the far side of the pier. The boards creaked under my weight, and the occasional swirling gust made me brace for a stronger wind, but it never came. I found no footprints besides my own. A damp patch near some crates might have been from a recent rainfall or a wave splash. As I was about to move on, I heard it again. That faint chord, almost like an echo of a Christmas carol, drifting across the water. I flicked off the flashlight again, letting the darkness enclose me. My breathing slowed, and I closed my eyes for a moment to focus on the sound. The hum rose and fell, too melodic to be a random noise, too faint to trace. My skin prickled again. The urge to find a logical explanation pushed me forward, so I swept my flashlight beam once more over the entire area. Still no sign of anyone. A few minutes later, I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was nearly midnight. The temperature felt even lower. My nose was numb, and my fingers were stiff in my gloves. I debated searching the shore for a possible vantage point, but it was mostly industrial buildings and a patch of vacant land. Instead, I slowly headed back down the pier, pausing at intervals. The wind seemed to carry a gentle murmur. Each time I tried to hone in on it, the sound vanished. When I reached the entrance to the dock, I decided to do one last sweep around the outer perimeter. The path near the water's edge was uneven, scattered with gravel. Small wooden posts along the shore had once supported fishing lines or nets. I found no footprints or signs of recent activity, aside from driftwood. The night sky was mostly clear. Stars glimmered faintly above, and the moon cast a silver haze over the water. After a thorough check yielded no clues, I finally concluded that there was nothing I could record as evidence. No trespassers, no hidden devices, no gatherings. Just that soft, elusive sound that came and went. I contacted dispatch again, explaining the situation. They told me to note it in my log and move on unless I found a specific reason to stay. I stood at the pier entrance for a moment, looking back at the dark stretch of wood. I exhaled, watching the warm breath drift upward. As I turned to leave, I thought I caught one last whisper of melody behind me. It sent a slight shiver through my back. I spun around and saw only the faint reflections of a few lights on the water. Nothing else. I walked back to my patrol car, my boots scuffing the gravel. The engine started with a low rumble, and I let the heater blow warm air on my face. I updated my notes on the laptop. No individuals located. Faint singing noise heard intermittently. Source undetermined. No violations observed. That was the best I could do. On my drive home, I couldn't shake the memory of that gentle chorus drifting across the water. It wasn't loud or frantic, just a soft, distant presence. It might have been a natural phenomenon, some acoustic trick, or a boat radio far upriver. But I never identified it. I checked back with dispatch a few days later to see if more reports came in. They had one or two more calls about the same phenomenon, but no new information. In the end, it went unsolved. The singing would sometimes return, according to a few residents, then fade away as quietly as it came. Some people labeled it a weird echo, while others thought it might be a ghostly choir, or just the wind playing tricks. I stuck to the facts. I'd heard something. It sounded like a faint melody, and I found no evidence of anyone on the pier. That December I kept thinking about how empty the dock felt, yet how alive it seemed with that strange hum. I still recall the feeling of standing there in the cold, the hair on my arms standing on end, listening for a faint tune just beyond my range of certainty. I went about my other calls and continued my shift schedule, but every time I passed near the river, I glanced toward the pier, half expecting to catch that soft singing again. It never offered me any clear explanation, just a lingering sense that not everything can be pinned down, even by the most careful search. Late shift. I was driving my patrol car through the quieter part of town, eyes scanning the empty sidewalks. Most businesses were closed for the holiday break. It was mid-December, well past midnight, and the temperature outside hovered around freezing. My dashboard clock read 2:14 a.m. The streets felt deserted. Snow lingered at the curbs, grayish from passing vehicles. A few street lamps buzzed overhead, casting weak light on the pavement. I turned onto a side street where a small bakery stood, shuttered for the holiday. Its sign said it would reopen after Christmas. The glass door had a sheet of paper taped inside, announcing the closure. Normally, I wouldn't pay much attention, but a soft glow flickered against the window. That light was out of place. The bakery should be dark at that hour. My pulse kicked up a notch as I parked along the curb. I left the engine running for warmth and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air felt sharp against my face. My boots clicked on the concrete. I approached the bakery's door, shining my flashlight through the glass. Beyond the display cases and empty shelves, I saw a small Christmas tree in the far corner, its lights dimly blinking. The interior looked mostly dark except for that faint glimmer. All the chairs were stacked on the tables, and the counter had no fresh pastries, obviously. Yet I noticed a brief, quick movement behind the counter. It might have been my reflection or something else. My stomach tensed. I cupped my hands around my eyes to reduce glare and pressed my forehead against the glass. The shop's interior smelled faintly of flour and sugar, the way bakeries often do, but the scent was weak through the cold air. The door appeared locked, and the lights behind the counter were off. I tapped on the glass, calling out to see if an employee was inside. No response. I tried the door gently. It didn't budge. That made sense, but I wanted to be sure. I radioed my position and requested a quick check. Dispatch acknowledged me, saying there were no reported break-ins in the area. Still, I wanted to be certain no one was inside who shouldn't be. I looked in again. The Christmas tree flickered on a short timer, going from a soft glow to an almost fading sparkle. It cast shadows near the floor, making shapes that shifted. I scanned the counter, the shelves, the dark corners. Everything appeared motionless. I took a step to the side to see better through a different angle. That's when I noticed a faint silhouette near the back, in the area that led to the kitchen. I froze, heart thumping. The shape vanished the second I tried to focus on it. I couldn't tell if it was just the reflection of the lights or if someone had darted away. My hands felt a little unsteady. I knocked on the glass again, firmly calling out, "Police! If anyone's in there, please show yourself." Silence. The place stayed still. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft hum of my patrol car's engine behind me. I unclipped my flashlight from my belt, using it to peer inside at a sharper angle. The beam revealed stacked chairs, wiped-down tables, and a row of upturned stools near the counter. Nothing seemed disturbed, no signs of theft or damage. Yet that Christmas tree continued blinking, a detail that nagged at me. Why would it be on if the bakery was closed until after Christmas? Possibly they had left it as a decoration, but it was unusual. My radio crackled, dispatch reminding me to confirm if I needed backup. I said I'd handle it alone for now, no immediate evidence of a break-in. I walked around the building, shining my flashlight on the side windows. They were frosted, but I could see partial silhouettes of stacked boxes and baking racks. No sign of forced entry. The back door looked secure, with no marks near the lock. I returned to the front, eyeing the Christmas tree again. I tried to see if it was simply running on a small battery pack or a random timer. The extension cord disappeared behind the counter. My breath fogged the glass as I stared inside. That's when I thought I saw another flicker of movement, this time like a small shadow passing near the tree. My chest tightened. I stepped back, uncertain if my eyes were playing tricks or if there really was someone inside. I considered calling the bakery's owner, but I didn't have their number on hand. The sign on the door only listed the usual business line. I didn't see any suspicious footprints in the snow outside the door, though it was hard to see in the dim streetlight. I pulled out my phone and tried to find any emergency contact for the bakery, but the official website only listed the business hours and the standard phone number. It wouldn't do me any good at that moment. I exhaled, feeling the cold in my lungs. My flashlight beam swept along the glass again. The Christmas tree lights blinked in a pattern, on for 2 seconds, off for 2 seconds. During one of the on phases, I saw something behind the counter shift. My pulse pounded, and I tapped the glass once more, raising my voice. "Hello? Anyone inside?" Again, no response. The shape didn't reappear. I tried to keep a grip on logic. It could have been my reflection, or maybe a coat rack. The uneven lighting could cast odd shapes. I reminded myself that the place was locked, so if anyone was inside, they either had a key or they broke in somehow. But the door and windows were intact. No alarms were triggered. My thoughts spun, but I maintained a steady breathing pattern to keep calm. I took a moment to glance up and down the street. The nearest business was a small florist's shop, lights off, closed for the night. No pedestrians, no passing cars, nothing. The occasional hum of a distant engine sounded blocks away. The wind picked up slightly, ruffling my jacket collar. I checked my watch, 2:28 a.m. I realized I'd been standing there for nearly 15 minutes. I decided to wait a bit longer, just to be certain. The bakery's interior remained quiet. The Christmas tree lights continued their relentless blink. On one pass of my flashlight, I noticed a faint smudge on the glass from the inside at about waist level. It looked like a partial handprint, but I couldn't be sure without a closer inspection. My instinct said it could be old. Bakeries often have smudges and prints, especially from employees. Still, it caught my eye. I kneeled down to see if the handprint revealed anything else, but the angle was awkward. The glass was tinted slightly near the bottom, probably for design. I stood up and tried the door handle again, even though I knew it was locked. No give. I tested the handle's sturdiness. It was solid. Another quick movement flashed near the counter, just at the corner of my vision. I turned my flashlight there, but there was nothing. My heart drummed in my ears. I felt a mild sweat forming under my uniform despite the cold air. I considered calling for backup, but I didn't have evidence of a crime, and it might have been nothing more than a reflection. Still, the feeling of being watched intensified. I glanced behind me, seeing only the silent street. When I refocused on the glass, I noticed the Christmas tree lights flicker in an irregular way, like they were losing power. The faint glow dimmed, then brightened again. I exhaled, frustrated by the uncertainty. My radio crackled once more, and I told dispatch I was still assessing. I decided to check the perimeter one more time. I walked behind the building, shining my flashlight low to the ground. No fresh footprints, no suspicious vehicles. When I rounded the corner to the front, the glass door looked the same, locked, undisturbed. I realized I was chasing shadows. With no forced entry, no alarms, and no actual signs of burglary, I had no cause to break in. If there was an employee in there for some reason, they weren't responding. I weighed my options. I could leave a note for the owner to check their security footage if they had any. That felt like the most reasonable step. I walked back to my car and found a small notepad. I scribbled a short message. Noticed lights on inside. Investigated possible movement. Found building locked. No sign of forced entry. Contact police if you have concerns or evidence of trespassing. I added my name and badge number. I taped the note to the bakery door. The glass felt cold against my knuckles. Through the window the Christmas tree blinked again, and for a split second I swore I saw a pale face reflect in one of the cooler glass doors behind the counter. My pulse raced, but when I stared at that spot, it was gone. My mind might have been messing with me. The combination of darkness, blinking lights, and my own tension could have created illusions. I stepped back and looked around once more. Everything was still. I realized I had to let it go. Without concrete evidence, I couldn't force entry. I returned to my patrol car, engine still running, heater providing a small cocoon of warmth. I sat there for a moment, my breath finally steadying. I typed a brief record in my onboard computer. 2:30 a.m. Observed interior light enclosed bakery. Investigated. Door locked, no break-in signs. Possible reflections or illusions inside. Left note for owner. That was all I could do officially. I drove away slowly, checking my rearview mirror as I went. The bakery faded into the distance, its door glowing faintly from my taillights. My mind stayed on that fleeting figure I thought I saw behind the counter. Maybe it was just the reflection of the Christmas tree lights on stainless steel surfaces. Or maybe an employee who didn't want to be seen. Either way, the situation ended without resolution. For the rest of my shift, I felt uneasy. Each time I passed a darkened storefront, I glanced twice, half expecting to see another flicker of movement. The call was routine on paper, an odd light in a closed shop, no forced entry. Yet the knot in my stomach suggested something else lingered there. I'd had a few calls like that before, moments where I couldn't confirm or dismiss what I saw. The memory of the blinking lights and the possible silhouette stuck with me. A couple of days later, I checked back to see if the bakery's owner reported anything. Nothing had come in. The note was gone from the door, so they must have found it. I wondered if they thought I was spooked by a simple reflection. Maybe they just forgot to switch off the tree lights. I never learned the exact explanation. But every time I drove past that bakery afterward, I found myself glancing at the windows just to be sure it was really empty. Sometimes, the simplest calls leave a lasting mark, especially when the night's shadows and a blinking tree light create illusions you can't fully explain.